The Founding Vision, Lei Jun and the Birth of Xiaomi, 2010. On a cold spring morning in April 2010, 8 people gathered around a simple table in a nondescript office in Beijing's Zhongguancun district, China's answer to Silicon Valley, and shared a bowl of millet congee. The rice porridge was humble, almost deliberately so, the kind of food that had sustained Chinese families through centuries of hardship and hope. It was warm, it was unpretentious, and it was shared. For Lei Jun, the man who had called this gathering, the symbolism was everything. The company they were about to build would be named after this grain, Xiaomi, meaning millet in Mandarin, and it would carry the spirit of that shared meal into every product it ever made, nourishing, accessible, and meant for everyone. But to understand why that bowl of congee mattered, why it became one of the most celebrated founding myths in modern Chinese business, you first have to understand the man who ladled it out. Lei Jun was not a wide-eyed dreamer fresh out of university. He was not a garage tinkerer or a college dropout stumbling into genius. At 40 years old, he was already one of the most accomplished figures in Chinese technology, a serial entrepreneur, a seasoned executive, and a prolific angel investor who had made fortunes for himself and others. And yet, by his own admission, something essential had been missing. The creation of Xiaomi was not the beginning of Lei Jun's career, it was the culmination of decades of restless searching for a purpose large enough to contain his ambitions. Lei Jun was born on December 16, 1969 in Shantao, a small city in Hubei province in central China. It was a modest beginning in a country still finding its footing after the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution. His family was not wealthy, but they valued education with the fierce determination common to Chinese households of that era. The young Lei Jun was studious, disciplined, and possessed of an intellectual hunger that went beyond what his local schools could easily satisfy. He devoured books, and one book in particular would alter the trajectory of his entire life. As an undergraduate at Wuhan University, where he enrolled in 1987 to study computer science, Lei Jun came across a Chinese translation of Fire in the Valley, the seminal account of the birth of Silicon Valley and the personal computer revolution. The stories of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak building Apple in a garage, of young visionaries who dared to imagine that computers could be personal, democratic, accessible. These narratives struck Lei Jun with the force of revelation. He would later recall that he was so moved after finishing the book that he couldn't sleep. He walked the campus for hours in the dark, his mind electric with a single consuming thought. He wanted to build something that mattered. He wanted to build a great company, one that could change the world. This was not idle daydreaming. Lei Jun was the kind of student who translated inspiration into action with startling speed. He completed his 4-year university curriculum in just 2 years, earning top marks and distinguishing himself as one of the most talented computer science students Wuhan had ever produced. His professors took notice, his peers took notice, but Lei Jun was already looking beyond the campus walls toward the nascent Chinese technology industry that was beginning to stir in the early 1990s. In 1992, at the age of 22, Lei Jun joined Kingsoft, a Chinese software company that was then a scrappy upstart trying to compete in a market dominated by Microsoft. It was here that Lei Jun would spend the next 16 years of his career, and it was here that he would learn, through triumph and through painful, grinding struggle, virtually everything he would later pour into Xiaomi. Kingsoft was, in many ways, the crucible that forged Lei Jun. He joined as an engineer, but rose with extraordinary speed through the ranks. He became the company's general manager by 1998, and under his leadership, Kingsoft grew from a small outfit into one of China's most recognizable software brands. The WPS Office Suite became a household name in China, a genuine domestic alternative to Microsoft Word and Excel, at a time when most Chinese consumers assumed that only foreign software could be trusted. Lei Jun pushed the company into gaming, into internet security, into online services. He drove Kingsoft to its initial public offering on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in 2007, a moment of vindication after years of relentless work. And yet, for all his success, Lei Jun carried with him a deep and abiding frustration. Kingsoft had survived, even thrived, but it had never truly broken through to greatness. The company had spent years locked in an exhausting battle with Microsoft, fighting for market share in a segment where the rules were written by someone else. Lei Jun had watched as Chinese internet companies, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, had exploded into global prominence during the 2000s, riding the wave of the internet revolution to valuations and cultural influence that dwarfed anything Kingsoft had achieved. He felt with a gnawing certainty that he had missed the defining technological shift of his generation. He had been so busy fighting in the software trenches that the internet age had largely passed him by. When Lei Jun finally stepped down as CEO of Kingsoft in 2007, he was wealthy, respected, and deeply unsatisfied. "I felt like I had been working so hard for so many years," he later confessed in interviews, "but I had not accomplished what I truly wanted to accomplish." The fire that had been lit by Fire in the Valley all those years ago at Wuhan University still burned, but it had not yet found its proper fuel. What followed was a period of reflection, exploration, and strategic reinvention that would prove essential to the Xiaomi story. Between 2007 and 2010, Lei Jun stepped back from the daily grind of running a company and became one of China's most active and insightful angel investors. He invested in a remarkable portfolio of startups, including UC Web, a mobile browser company that Alibaba would later acquire for a reported $4.4 billion, YY, a social entertainment platform, and Winkle, an online fashion retailer. These investments were not random bets. Each one was a carefully placed probe into the sectors Lei Jun believed would define the next decade of Chinese technology: mobile internet, social platforms, and e-commerce. Through his investing, Lei Jun gained something invaluable: a panoramic view of where the technology industry was heading. He spent hours with founders, engineers, and product designers, absorbing their perspectives, studying their mistakes, and mapping the contours of the emerging mobile revolution. By 2009, the picture had become strikingly clear to him. The smartphone was going to be the most important computing platform in the world. Apple's iPhone, launched in 2007, had demonstrated that a phone could be a computer, a camera, a music player, a gateway to the internet, and a fashion statement all at once. Google's Android operating system, released in 2008, had shown that this revolution could be open source, customizable, and available to anyone willing to build on it. But as Lei Jun surveyed the Chinese market, he saw a gaping chasm. On one side stood Apple, whose iPhones were exquisitely designed but priced far beyond the reach of ordinary Chinese consumers. An iPhone cost several months' salary for a typical Chinese worker. It was an object of aspiration, not accessibility. On the other side stood a sea of cheap, poorly made Android phones from domestic manufacturers who competed solely on price, cutting corners on components, software, and user experience until their products were barely functional. The Chinese consumer was trapped between two unacceptable extremes: unaffordable excellence or affordable mediocrity. Lei Jun saw in this gap not just a business opportunity, but a moral imperative. He believed with an intensity that bordered on missionary zeal that great technology should not be a luxury reserved for the wealthy. He had grown up in a family of modest means. He had watched his country transform at breathtaking speed, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. He understood, viscerally, that these newly middle-class Chinese consumers deserved products that respected both their wallets and their intelligence. They deserved smartphones that were beautiful, powerful, and affordable, and nobody was building them. This was the insight that crystallized into Xiaomi's founding vision to create hardware products with the quality and design sensibility of Apple, but at prices that ordinary people could afford. It was a vision that seemed, to many observers at the time, impossibly naive. The technology industry's economics did not work that way. High quality meant high costs, meant high prices. That was the iron logic of hardware manufacturing. To break that logic, you would need an entirely new business model, an entirely new relationship with consumers, and an entirely new way of thinking about what a technology company could be. Lei Jun believed he had the answers. During his years of reflection and investing, he had developed a radical thesis about how a new kind of company could be built. First, it would sell its hardware at prices barely above cost, sometimes even at cost, deliberately sacrificing the fat margins that traditional hardware companies depended on. Second, it would make its real money from internet services, software, content, advertising, and cloud services layered on top of the hardware. The hardware would be the door. The internet services would be the house. Third, it would cut out the traditional retail middlemen, the distributors, the physical stores, the layers of markup, by selling directly to consumers online. Fourth, and perhaps most radically, it would build its products in collaboration with its users, treating them not as passive consumers, but as active participants in the design and development process. This was not just a business plan, it was a philosophical framework, and Lai Jun articulated it with a clarity and conviction that would draw some of the most talented people in Chinese technology to his side. The process of assembling the founding team was itself a masterclass in Lai Jun's persuasive powers and his deep network within the technology industry. He did not simply post job listings or hire recruiters. He personally courted each of the 7 co-founders over months of conversations, meals, and late-night discussions about what they could build together. The team he assembled was extraordinary in its breadth and depth. Lin Bin, who would become Xiaomi's president, was a former president of Google China and before that had spent years at Microsoft. He brought deep expertise in engineering management, international perspective, and an understanding of how the world's best technology companies operated from the inside. Zhou Guangping came from Motorola, where he had worked on hardware design and manufacturing. Li Wangchong, who would lead Xiaomi's marketing, had co-founded a design firm and understood the intersection of aesthetics and consumer psychology. The remaining co-founders, Huang Jiangji, Liu De, Hong Feng, and Wang Chuan, brought complementary expertise spanning industrial design, software engineering, and product management. What was remarkable about this group was not just their individual credentials, but the diversity of their institutional backgrounds. They came from Google, Microsoft, Motorola, and Kingsoft, from American and Chinese companies, from hardware and software traditions, from engineering and design disciplines. Lei Jun had deliberately sought out people who would bring different perspectives to the table, but share a common dissatisfaction with the status quo and a common hunger to build something transformative. He wanted people who had seen how the best companies in the world operated and who understood both the strengths and the limitations of those models. Recruiting them was not easy. These were accomplished professionals with comfortable careers and established reputations. Asking them to leave the safety of Google or Microsoft to join a startup with no product, no revenue, and a business model that most industry veterans would consider suicidal required more than a good pitch deck. It required a vision so compelling that it could override rational caution. Lei Jun provided that vision, not through PowerPoint slides, but through the sheer intensity of his belief. He spoke about the hundreds of millions of Chinese consumers who deserved better technology. He spoke about the mobile internet revolution and the once-in-a-generation opportunity it represented. He spoke about building a company that would be remembered not just for making money, but for changing the way people lived. One by one, they said yes. The formal founding of Xiaomi took place on April 6, 2010, in a small office in Beijing's Zhongguancun district, the neighborhood often called China's Silicon Valley, a dense cluster of technology companies, universities, and research institutions that had incubated some of the country's most important tech ventures. The moment was deliberately understaged. There was no press conference, no splashy launch event, no public announcement. 8 people gathered around a table, shared a pot of millet congee, a humble, traditional Chinese porridge, and toasted to the beginning of something they believed would be extraordinary. The choice of millet congee was not accidental. Xiaomi literally translates to little rice, or millet, and the name itself was laden with intention. Millet is one of the most ancient and fundamental grains in Chinese agriculture, a staple that has sustained the country's people for thousands of years. It is nourishing, unpretentious, and accessible. By naming the company Xiaomi, Lei Jun was making a statement about what the company aspired to be: essential, affordable, close to the people. There was also a playful irony embedded in the name, a wink at the Buddhist concept of a grain of rice as large as a mountain, the idea that something small and humble could contain immense potential. Lei Jun later added another interpretation, suggesting a Mi could stand for mobile internet, connecting the grain metaphor to the company's technological ambitions. The name worked on multiple levels, and that multiplicity was characteristic of Lei Jun's thinking. Every detail considered, every symbol recruited into the larger narrative. The early days in that Zhongguancun office were defined by a kind of focused chaos that only the best startups achieve. The 8 co-founders worked in a single open room, the space cluttered with whiteboards covered in diagrams, phones from every manufacturer lined up on desks for comparison, and stacks of components that the hardware team was evaluating. There was no hierarchy to speak of in those first months. The former presidents and vice presidents of multinational corporations sat shoulder to shoulder with junior engineers, arguing about kernel optimizations and icon designs with equal passion. Lei Jun had deliberately cultivated this flatness, believing that the worst thing a startup could do was import the bureaucratic structures of the large companies its founders had left behind. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes over bowls of noodles at the cheap restaurants that surrounded their building. Mistakes were made just as quickly and corrected without blame or recrimination. The energy was electric, fueled by the conviction that they were not merely starting another company, but laying the foundation for a new model of how technology could reach people. The company's initial financing reflected both the ambition of the venture and the credibility of its founder. Lei Jun invested a significant portion of his personal fortune, reportedly putting in around $10 million of his own money. This was not a token gesture of skin in the game. It was a substantial commitment that signaled to everyone, co-founders and future investors alike, that Lei Jun was betting his personal wealth on this vision. Early institutional investors included Morningside Venture Capital, Qiming Venture Partners, and IDG Capital, firms with deep experience in Chinese technology investments. The initial round of funding, totaling approximately $41 million, valued the young company at around $250 million, a figure that struck many industry observers as generous for a company that had no product and no revenue. But these investors were not betting on a product, they were betting on Lei Jun's track record, on the caliber of the team he had assembled, and on the thesis that the Chinese smartphone market was about to explode, and that the existing players were leaving an enormous gap between what consumers wanted and what they were being offered. What made the early strategic discussions at Xiaomi so distinctive was the degree to which Lei Jun and his co-founders thought about the company not as hardware manufacturer, but as an internet company that happened to make hardware. This distinction, which might seem semantic to outsiders, was in fact the conceptual core of everything Xiaomi would become. Traditional hardware companies made money the way hardware companies had always made money, by designing products, manufacturing them, and selling them at a markup that covered costs and generated profit. The bigger the markup, the better the business. Apple had perfected this model, commanding margins that made it one of the most profitable companies on earth. Chinese manufacturers like Huawei and ZTE operated on thinner margins but still followed the same fundamental logic. Lei Jun wanted to invert this logic entirely. He envisioned the model where the hardware itself would be sold at or near cost, generating little or no profit on the device itself, and the company would instead monetize through internet services, software, and the ongoing relationship with the user. The smartphone would not be the product, it would be the gateway. Once a consumer entered the Xiaomi ecosystem, they would encounter a universe of applications, content, services, and eventually connected devices, each generating small streams of revenue that would collectively sustain the company. This was not an entirely novel idea. Amazon had pursued a similar logic with its Kindle devices, and Google's Android strategy had elements of this thinking. But no one had attempted to apply this model to smartphones at the scale Lei Jun was envisioning, particularly in a market as vast and complex as China's. The implications of this strategic choice rippled through every aspect of how the company would operate. If hardware margins were going to be razor thin, then every cost in the value chain needed to be scrutinized and minimized. This meant eliminating the traditional retail distribution model, which could add 30 to 50% to the final price of a device through layers of wholesalers, distributors, and brick-and-mortar retailers. Xiaomi would sell directly to consumers through its own website, cutting out every intermediary. This meant that marketing budgets needed to be slashed as well. There would be no multi-million-dollar television advertising campaigns, no celebrity endorsements, no glossy billboards. Instead, the company would rely on word of mouth, social media, and the passionate advocacy of its users. This meant that traditional research and development timelines, where a product might spend years in development before reaching consumers, needed to be compressed dramatically, with user feedback incorporated in near real time. Each of these operational decisions was radical on its own. Together, they constituted a complete reimagining of how a technology company could function, and each decision carried enormous risk. Selling online only meant excluding the vast majority of Chinese consumers who in 2010 still purchased electronics in physical stores and were uncomfortable with e-commerce. Spending almost nothing on marketing meant relying entirely on the quality of the product and the enthusiasm of early adopters to generate awareness. Compressing development timelines meant accepting that early versions of products would be imperfect and trusting that users would be patient enough to participate in their improvement. It was a high-wire act, and the safety net was non-existent. But Lei Jun had studied the patterns of disruptive innovation with the meticulousness of an academic and the instincts of a veteran entrepreneur, and he believed deeply that the timing was right. By 2010, several converging forces were creating the conditions for exactly the kind of company he wanted to build. China's internet penetration was surging, with hundreds of millions of new users coming online each year, increasingly through mobile devices rather than desktop computers. E-commerce platforms like Taobao and JD.com were normalizing online purchasing, eroding the psychological barriers that had kept Chinese consumers tethered to physical retail. Social media platforms, particularly Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, which launched in 2009, were creating new channels through which passionate communities could form and spread the word about products they loved. The cost of manufacturing high-quality smartphone components was declining rapidly, driven by scale economies and fierce competition among Chinese suppliers. And the dominant smartphones on the market, whether Apple's iPhone at the premium end or the various Android devices from Samsung, HTC, and domestic players, were either too expensive for the average Chinese consumer or too mediocre in quality to inspire loyalty. Lei Jun saw these converging trends and understood that they created a window of opportunity that would not stay open forever. The right company entering the market at the right moment with the right model could capture an enormous consumer base before incumbents recognized the threat and adapted. Speed was essential, but so was quality. Not the absolute no-compromise quality of an iPhone, perhaps, but a level of quality that dramatically exceeded what consumers expected at a given price point. The Xiaomi value proposition, at its essence, was about shattering the assumption that affordable meant inferior. Lei Jun wanted consumers to pick up a Xiaomi device and feel astonished, not that it was the best phone in the world, but that something this good could cost this little. In those foundational months, even before the company had a physical product to sell, Lei Jun established internal principles that would govern how Xiaomi operated. He was a relentless list maker and codifier, someone who believed that articulating principles clearly was essential to ensuring that a growing organization made consistent decisions. Among the most important of these principles was what Lei Jun called the triathlon business model: hardware, internet services, and new retail, where success required excellence in all three dimensions simultaneously, not just one. Another was the concept of extreme price-to-performance ratio, which in Chinese was expressed as the now famous phrase, 感动人心,价格厚道, roughly products that move people's hearts at honest prices. This phrase would become Xiaomi's unofficial creed, repeated in meetings, printed on walls, and internalized by employees at every level of the company. Lei Jun also established a cultural principle that would prove critical to Xiaomi's early success and that distinguished it sharply from most Chinese technology companies of the era: genuine reciprocal engagement with users. This was not the superficial customer engagement that most companies practiced: the surveys, the focus groups, the carefully managed social media accounts. Lei Jun envisioned something far more radical: a development process where users would have direct input into the features, design, and evolution of Xiaomi's products. They would test early versions, report bugs, suggest improvements, and vote on feature priorities. The company would listen, not out of politeness, but out of genuine strategic necessity, because the feedback of its most engaged users was the most valuable and cost-effective form of research and development available. This philosophy, that users were not just customers but co-creators, would become the beating heart of Xiaomi's culture and the foundation upon which its first products would be built. By mid-2010, the company that had been born over bowls of millet congee had taken shape as something more than a vision and a team. It had financing, a strategy, a set of guiding principles, and a culture that was already distinct and powerful. Its founders had mapped out the competitive landscape with precision and identified the gap they intended to exploit. They understood the risks they were taking and had made their peace with them. What they needed now was a product, not a phone, not yet, but something that would prove the concept, attract the users, and build the community upon which everything else would depend. The decision to start not with hardware but with software, to build an operating system before building a phone, was one of the most consequential strategic choices in Xiaomi's history. It reflected Lei Jun's belief that in the mobile internet age, the software experience was more fundamental than the hardware that delivered it. It reflected the practical reality that developing a smartphone from scratch required time, money, and supply chain relationships that the young company was still building. And it reflected a deeper insight about community, that a software product could be released incrementally, improved continuously, and used as a vehicle for building the kind of passionate, invested user base that would become Xiaomi's most powerful competitive advantage. Before there was a phone, there would be an operating system. Before there was a product, there would be a community. And before there was a business, there would be a relationship between a company and its users, unlike anything the Chinese technology industry had seen before. As 2010 progressed and the small team in Zhongguan-kun poured itself into the work, there was no guarantee that any of this would succeed. The smartphone market was brutally competitive, littered with the corpses of companies that had entered with ambition and exited with nothing. The business model Lei Jun had outlined defied conventional wisdom and invited skepticism from analysts, competitors, and even some potential partners. The company had no brand recognition, no distribution network, no manufacturing facilities, and no track record in consumer electronics. What it had was a founder with an unshakable vision, a team of exceptional talent, a strategic framework that was internally coherent even if externally unproven, and a founding culture that prized speed, humility, and an almost fanatical devotion to the user. Whether those assets would be enough to overcome the formidable obstacles ahead was a question that only time could answer. But in that modest office, surrounded by whiteboards and borrowed phones and the remnants of countless shared meals, 8 people believed with every fiber of their being that they were building something the world needed. That belief, more than any business plan or financial projection, was the true founding capital of Xiaomi. MIUI and the fan-driven software revolution, 2010-2011. Software first, hardware later. In the spring of 2010, while the rest of the consumer electronics world obsessed over sleek industrial designs and supply chain logistics, a small team of engineers in a nondescript Beijing office was doing something that most industry observers would have considered backwards, if not outright foolish. They were building a phone company that had no phone, no prototype tucked away in a lab, no negotiations with Foxconn or any other manufacturer, no bill of materials, no antenna designs, no arguments about screen size or battery capacity. What they had instead was a radical conviction that the soul of a smartphone was not its body, but its mind, its software. And so Xiaomi's first product would not be a device you could hold in your hand. It would be an operating system you could install on someone else's. This was MIUI, pronounced MIUI by its creators, though fans would eventually settle on a variety of pronunciations that became a small badge of tribal identity in themselves. The name was a compression of Mi, the company's emerging brand identity, carrying connotations of mobile internet and the Chinese character for rice, and IU, user interface. It was, at its core, a custom firmware built on top of Android's open-source code, a deeply modified skin that reimagined nearly every aspect of how a person interacted with their smartphone. But to describe MIUI merely as a custom ROM would be like describing the Renaissance as a period when some Italians picked up paintbrushes. What MIUI represented and what it unleashed was a fundamentally new relationship between a technology company and its users, one that would define Xiaomi's DNA for everything that followed. To understand why this approach was so radical, one must first appreciate the landscape of smartphone software in 2010. Android, Google's open-source mobile operating system, was still in its adolescence. Version 2.1, Eclair, and 2.2, Froyo, were the dominant releases, and while the platform was functional, it was also widely regarded as rough around the edges, particularly in comparison to Apple's iOS, which had a 3-year head start in polish and ecosystem development. Android's interface was utilitarian, sometimes confusing, and inconsistently designed across the various manufacturers who had adopted it. Samsung had just begun experimenting with its TouchWiz overlay. HTC had its Sense UI. But these were largely cosmetic modifications, thin veneers of branding painted over the same underlying experience. In China, the situation was even more complicated. Google's relationship with the Chinese government had deteriorated sharply, culminating in Google's partial withdrawal from the Chinese market in early 2010 after disputes over censorship and a major cyber attack. This meant that Chinese Android phones sold in China typically shipped without Google Play services, no Gmail integration, no Google Maps, no Play Store. Chinese Android users existed in a parallel universe where the operating system's core functionality was intact, but its connective tissue to Google's ecosystem was severed. This created both a problem and an extraordinary opportunity. The problem was that Chinese Android phones felt incomplete, orphaned from the services that gave the platform much of its utility. The opportunity was that someone could step in and fill that void, not just with alternative apps, but with a completely reimagined experience tailored specifically for Chinese users. Lei Zhen and his co-founders saw this gap with crystalline clarity, but their ambition went beyond localization. They wanted to prove a thesis that Lei Jun had been developing for years through his experience as CEO of Kingsoft and as an angel investor in numerous internet startups. That the methods of internet software development, rapid iteration, direct user feedback, data-driven decision-making, and the cultivation of passionate communities could be applied to the creation of a mobile operating system. In the traditional model, an operating system was developed behind closed doors by a large team of engineers, released in major versions, separated by months or years, and updated primarily to fix bugs rather than to respond to user desires. Lei Jun wanted to invert this entirely. He envisioned an operating system that would be updated every single week, with each update shaped directly by the voices of its users. The 100 Dream Sponsors. The story of MIUI's origin is inseparable from the story of its first 100 users. In the summer of 2010, before the software had even reached a state that most companies would consider alpha quality, Xiaomi's small software team, led by co-founders Li Wancheng, Hong Feng, and Huang Jiangji, began quietly reaching out across Chinese technology forums, particularly the vibrant communities that had grown up around Android modding and custom ROM development. These forums were populated by a particular breed of technology enthusiast, people who didn't just use their phones, but tinkered with them obsessively, flashing new firmware on weekends the way car enthusiasts might swap out engine parts. They were knowledgeable, opinionated, technically literate, and crucially, hungry for something better than what the market was offering them. Xiaomi's team didn't approach these forums with a polished marketing campaign. There were no press releases, no banner advertisements, no celebrity endorsements. Instead, individual team members joined discussions, asked questions, shared their frustrations with existing Android experiences, and gradually began identifying the most passionate, articulate, and technically capable participants. It was a process more akin to casting for a theater production than launching a product, an intimate, personal selection of individuals who would become not just users, but collaborators. From this process, Xiaomi identified 100 individuals who would become the very first MIUI users. The company would later immortalize them as the 100 Dream Sponsors, or Miansheng Zanju Sheng, a title that carried deliberate weight. These were not beta testers in the conventional corporate sense, unpaid labor performing quality assurance. They were, in Xiaomi's framing, partners in a shared dream. Their names would eventually be enshrined in MIUI's loading screen, scrolling past every time the system booted up, a permanent monument to the idea that these 100 strangers from internet forums were as essential to the product's creation as any engineer on the payroll. On August 16, 2010, MIUI's first version was released to this tiny group. The date would become one of the founding mythological moments of Xiaomi's history. The company would later choose August 16th as the date for major product launches, turning it into an annual celebration. But on that first day, there was nothing celebratory about the software itself. It was rough, it crashed, features were incomplete. The user interface, while showing flashes of the ambition that would later distinguish it, was riddled with the kind of imperfections that would have embarrassed any traditional software company into delaying the release by months. But that was precisely the point. Xiaomi did not want to release a finished product. They wanted to release a living one, an organism that would grow and evolve in real time, shaped by the hands of the people who used it. And those first 100 users, rather than being disappointed by the software's rough state, were electrified by it. They had been invited not to consume a product, but to build one. The distinction was transformative, the Friday ritual. What happened next established a cadence that would become the heartbeat of Xiaomi's early existence and one of the most remarkable experiments in collaborative product development the technology industry had ever seen. Every Friday, without fail, Xiaomi released a new version of MIUI. Not a minor patch, not a hotfix, a genuine update that added features, redesigned interfaces, fixed bugs reported by users, and responded to suggestions posted on the community forums throughout the preceding week. The weekly update cycle was, by any conventional measure, insane. Major operating system updates from companies like Apple, Google, and Microsoft were measured in months and years, developed through rigorous internal testing processes that prioritize stability above all else. Even the most agile software startups in Silicon Valley typically operated on 2-week sprint cycles for internal development, with public releases happening far less frequently. Xiaomi was promising and delivering a new version of an entire mobile operating system every 7 days. The rhythm created a feedback loop of extraordinary intensity. A user might post a suggestion on Monday, perhaps requesting a new way to organize the notification shade, or a tweak to how the dialer handled recent calls, or a visual change to the lock screen clock. By Wednesday, engineers would be responding in the forum thread, asking clarifying questions, debating the merits of different implementation approaches, sometimes pushing back with technical explanations of why a particular request was difficult or inadvisable. By Thursday night, the development team would be in the final stages of compiling the week's build, incorporating as many user-requested changes as possible. And on Friday, users would flash the new firmware onto their phones, a process that required a level of technical comfort that filtered the community towards its most dedicated members, and immediately begin testing, evaluating, and posting feedback that would feed into the following week's cycle. This wasn't just rapid iteration. It was co-creation at a pace and intimacy that blurred the line between company and community. MIUI's early forums became a buzzing hive of activity, where users didn't merely report bugs, they debated design philosophy, argued about icon aesthetics, proposed feature roadmaps, and sometimes designed interface mock-ups that Xiaomi's engineers would adopt with minimal modification. The most prolific and insightful contributors earned recognition within the community, accumulating reputation scores and special forum titles that marked them as trusted voices. Some of these early community members would eventually be hired by Xiaomi directly, completing the dissolution of the boundary between user and creator. Li Wanqiang, the co-founder who oversaw Xiaomi's marketing and community operations, later described this period as the purest expression of what he called participation sense, a concept he would eventually codify in a best-selling book of the same name. The idea was deceptively simple, but profoundly counterintuitive for the technology industry of 2010. That the act of participating in a product's creation generated an emotional bond far more powerful than any marketing campaign can manufacture. When a user saw their suggestion implemented in Friday's update, they didn't just feel heard, they felt ownership. MIUI wasn't Xiaomi's operating system, it was their operating system, and they would defend it, evangelize it, and pour hours of unpaid labor into improving it with the fervor of co-founders. Designing for China, designing for humans. While the community dynamics of MIUI's development were revolutionary, the software itself was far more than a social experiment. It was a genuinely ambitious reimagining of the Android experience, and many of the design decisions that distinguished it in 2010 and 2011 would later be recognized as prescient, adopted by Google itself, by competing manufacturers, and by the broader mobile industry. The most immediately obvious difference between MIUI and stock Android was the elimination of the app drawer. In standard Android, the home screen held a curated selection of app shortcuts and widgets, while the full library of installed applications lived in a separate drawer accessed by a dedicated button. This two-tiered system, borrowed from the desktop computing paradigm of shortcuts and program folders, was functional but added a layer of abstraction that many users, particularly those in China, where smartphone adoption was surging among people who had never owned a desktop computer, found confusing. MIUI eliminated the app drawer entirely, placing all installed applications directly on the home screen in a grid that could be organized across multiple pages. It was a design choice that mirrored iOS's approach, and while it drew criticism from Android purists who valued the flexibility of the drawer system, it dramatically simplified the user experience for the hundreds of millions of people who would eventually encounter it. But MIUI's innovations went far deeper than layout. The team built an entirely new visual language, a rich, colorful, highly themable interface that felt warmer and more inviting than Android's utilitarian default. They redesigned the phone dialer, the messaging app, the settings menu, and the notification system from scratch. In each case, asking not how does Android do this, but how should a phone do this? The Contacts app was redesigned to surface the people you communicated with most frequently. The messaging interface was rebuilt to feel more conversational, anticipating the chat bubble aesthetic that would later become universal. The settings menu was reorganized around tasks rather than technical categories, making it accessible to users who didn't know or care about the distinction between wireless and networks and device. Perhaps most importantly for the Chinese market, MIUI integrated services and features that addressed the specific needs and habits of Chinese smartphone users in ways that neither stock Android nor competing manufacturer skins attempted. The firmware included built-in spam call blocking, a critical feature in China, where unsolicited telemarketing calls were endemic and infuriating. It offered enhanced dual SIM management, reflecting the common Chinese practice of carrying two phone numbers, often one for personal use and one for business. It integrated popular Chinese internet services and payment systems in ways that felt native rather than bolted on. And it provided granular privacy and permission controls that gave users fine-tuned authority over what each app could access, a feature that wouldn't become standard in stock Android for years. The theming system deserves particular attention because it became one of MIUI's most beloved features and a powerful demonstration of the community-driven philosophy at work. MIUI allowed users to completely transform the visual appearance of their phone, not just the wallpaper, but every icon, every button, every status bar element, every animation, through downloadable themes. Xiaomi provided tools and documentation that enabled artistically inclined community members to create and share their own themes, and a vibrant ecosystem of theme designers quickly emerged. Some themes mimicked the appearance of iOS or Windows Phone. Others were wildly creative, transforming the phone interface into steampunk dashboards, anime-inspired fantasies, or minimalist works of digital art. The theme store became a creative community unto itself, and the most popular designers achieved a degree of celebrity within the MIUI ecosystem. This was not merely cosmetic indulgence, it was a strategic embodiment of a core Xiaomi principle that personalization creates attachment. A phone running a stock operating system is interchangeable with any other phone running the same system. A phone running MIUI with a carefully selected theme, customized toggles, and features that the user themselves had helped request and refine was irreplaceably theirs. The switching cost wasn't financial, it was emotional. Growing beyond the 100. Through the autumn of 2010 and into early 2011, MIUI's user base grew with a momentum that surprised even Xiaomi's most optimistic projections. The original 100 Dream sponsors had become evangelists, spreading word of the firmware across the Chinese technology forums where they had been recruited and into new communities beyond. Each Friday update brought not just new features, but new users, drawn by the growing reputation of a piece of software that seemed to improve at an almost magical pace. By the end of 2010, MIUI had been downloaded and installed by tens of thousands of users. By mid-2011, the number had surpassed 500,000. These were not casual app downloaders. Every single one of them had undertaken a process that required genuine technical commitment, unlocking their phone's bootloader, often voiding their warranty in the process, downloading the MIUI ROM file, entering their phone's recovery mode, and flashing the firmware, a procedure that, if done incorrectly, could render their device temporarily unusable or bricked. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people were willing to go through this process on phones made by other companies to run Xiaomi's software was a testament to the quality of the product and the fervor of the community. The community forums evolved into something that resembled a small city. There were dedicated sections for bug reports, organized with meticulous categorization systems that the community itself had developed and maintained. There were feature request threads where suggestions were upvoted by fellow users, creating a democratic prioritization system that Xiaomi's engineers monitored closely. There were tutorial sections where experienced users patiently guided newcomers through the installation process. There were localization teams, volunteers who translated MIUI into languages beyond Chinese, including English, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Vietnamese, and Indonesian, that foreshadowed Xiaomi's eventual global ambitions years before the company sold a single phone outside of China. The international dimension of MIUI's growth was particularly remarkable because it was almost entirely organic. Xiaomi had no international marketing budget, no global distribution partnerships, no presence in any market outside mainland China. Yet the open-source nature of the project, combined with the universal appeal of a beautifully designed, feature-rich Android experience, attracted developers and users from across the world. Independent community teams ported MIUI to devices it was never designed for: Samsung Galaxy phones, HTC models, even some obscure devices from manufacturers that most Western consumers had never heard of. These unofficial ports were maintained by volunteer developers who reverse-engineered device-specific drivers and adapted the firmware to hardware configurations Xiaomi's own team had never tested. The result was a sprawling, slightly chaotic, but deeply passionate global community that grew entirely under its own power. This organic internationalization taught Xiaomi something invaluable about the nature of digital communities in the early 2010s. Traditional companies spent millions of dollars on market research, focus groups, and localization consultancies to understand foreign markets. Xiaomi was receiving that intelligence for free, delivered by passionate volunteers who not only translated the software, but explained to the engineering team in Beijing why certain features mattered more in Brazil than in Beijing, why the notification system needed to behave differently for users in India, where data connectivity was intermittent and expensive, why the theming engine needed to support right-to-left text rendering for Arabic-speaking users who were flashing MIUI onto their devices in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. These weren't abstract market studies, they were dispatches from the field, written by people who had skin in the game because they were living with the software every day. Lei Jun watched this phenomenon with a mixture of delight and philosophical satisfaction. What was unfolding confirmed his deepest instincts about the Internet era's potential to transform product development. In his years investing in technology companies and studying the industry's great success stories, he had come to believe that the traditional model of corporate consumer interaction, where companies spoke and consumers listened, where products were finished artifacts delivered from on high, was fundamentally obsolete. MIUI was proving that an alternative model could work at scale, one where the boundary between producer and consumer blurred until it nearly disappeared, where products existed in a state of permanent evolution, and where the community wasn't just a marketing asset, but a genuine co-creator of the product itself. The internal culture at Xiaomi during this period reflected this philosophy in ways both large and small. Engineers were required to spend time in the forums every day, not as an occasional exercise in customer engagement, but as a core part of their workflow. Product decisions were not made in closed conference rooms, but debated openly in threads where any registered community member could weigh in. When a particularly contentious design choice arose, the layout of the dialer, the behavior of the lock screen, the default wallpaper for a new release, Xiaomi would sometimes put it to a community vote, publishing the results and implementing the winner regardless of whether it aligned with the design team's initial preference. This wasn't a gimmick or a PR strategy. It was a genuinely different way of building software, and it attracted a particular kind of engineer to Xiaomi's offices. People who were less interested in the hermetic perfection of a Steve Jobs keynote and more energized by the messy, democratic, endlessly iterative process of making something with a crowd. The weekly release cadence, which had seemed ambitious when it was first established, became the heartbeat of the entire organization. Every Monday, the team would review the previous Friday's release, analyzing crash reports, reading forum feedback, and prioritizing the week's work. Tuesday through Thursday was a sprint of development and testing. Friday morning was a final round of quality assurance, and Friday afternoon was release day, a moment that carried a ritualistic weight for both the team and the community. Users began calling it Orange Friday, a reference to MIUI's brand color, and the release of each new version became a weekly event that fans genuinely looked forward to, the way sports fans anticipate a weekly match, or television viewers await a new episode of their favorite show. This rhythm created something that no traditional software company had quite achieved: a sense of shared narrative. Each week's update was a new chapter in a story that the community was helping to write. Users would post detailed change logs annotated with their personal reactions, celebrating features they had requested, and noting bugs they had reported that were now fixed. They would screenshot their personalized home screens and share them in dedicated setup showcase threads that ran to hundreds of pages. They would create video reviews of each weekly update, posting them to Youku and later YouTube, building personal followings as MIUI commentators. Some of these community members became minor celebrities within the Xiaomi ecosystem, recognized by username and avatar, their opinions carrying weight that rivaled that of Xiaomi's own employees. The emotional texture of this community was something that analysts and competitors struggled to understand from the outside. To a casual observer, it might have looked like mere brand loyalty, the same kind of tribal attachment that Apple users felt toward their iPhones, or that Samsung fans exhibited in online debates. But the MIUI community's attachment was qualitatively different because it was rooted in agency. Apple users loved their devices, but they had no meaningful influence over what those devices became. Samsung fans admired their phone's hardware, but Samsung's software decisions were made in corporate labs in Suwon with no community input whatsoever. MIUI users, by contrast, could point to specific features in the firmware and say, truthfully, I helped make that happen. They could trace the lineage of a design change from their own forum post through the community discussion, to the poll, to the implementation, and that sense of authorship created a bond that no amount of marketing spending could replicate. This bond manifested in behaviors that would prove commercially significant when Xiaomi eventually began selling hardware. Community members defended MIUI and Xiaomi with a fervor that sometimes startled outsiders. On technology forums across the Chinese internet, Baidu Tieba, Zhihu, Weibo, and dozens of smaller platforms, MIUI users would appear in threads about smartphone software to champion the firmware with detailed, passionate arguments. They weren't paid shills or organized astroturfers. They were genuine believers who felt a sense of ownership over the product and, by extension, the company that had made them feel like partners rather than customers. When competitors or skeptics questioned MIUI's quality, the community would respond with the righteous indignation of people defending something they had personally built. This dynamic also created a feedback loop that accelerated MIUI's improvement. Because the community was emotionally invested, they were extraordinarily diligent bug reporters. A typical software company might receive vague complaints from frustrated users, like, the phone is slow, the camera doesn't work right. MIUI's community members filed bug reports that read like engineering documents, complete with device specifications, steps to reproduce, log files, and sometimes even proposed fixes. Xiaomi's quality assurance team found that community-reported bugs were often identified faster and documented more thoroughly than those caught by internal testing. The community was, in effect, a massive unpaid QA department, but one that worked not out of obligation, but out of love. The sophistication of the community's contributions extended beyond bug reports into genuine feature innovation. Some of MIUI's most beloved features originated not from Xiaomi's design team, but from community suggestions that sparked internal development. The idea for MIUI's dual app functionality, which allowed users to run two instances of the same application simultaneously, invaluable for people who maintained separate personal and business accounts on messaging platforms, reportedly emerged from a forum discussion. The concept for MIUI's scrolling screenshot feature, which let users capture an entire long web page or chat thread in a single image, was championed by community members long before it became an industry standard that Android itself would eventually adopt. These weren't trivial additions. They were genuinely innovative features that gave MIUI a meaningful functional advantage over stock Android and competing manufacturer skins alike. By mid-2011, MIUI project had achieved something that existed at the intersection of software engineering, community building, and cultural movement. It had demonstrated that a startup with no hardware products, no carrier relationships, and no retail presence could build a user base numbering in the hundreds of thousands purely on the strength of its software and the emotional resonance of its community model. It had created a brand, Xiaomi, that meant something specific and powerful to a large number of technically sophisticated users: innovation, accessibility, responsiveness, and respect for the user's intelligence and agency. And it had generated an extraordinary amount of real-world product knowledge, as the team had iterated through dozens of weekly releases, accumulating an intimate understanding of what Android users wanted, what frustrated them, and how software could be crafted to feel not just functional, but delightful. Perhaps most importantly, MIUI had validated the economic model that would underpin Xiaomi's entire business strategy. The firmware was free. Xiaomi charged nothing for it, and never would, but it had created an ecosystem of engagement, themes, wallpapers, ringtones, and eventually app distribution and content services that hinted at monetization pathways. More immediately, it had built an audience of enthusiastic, technically literate consumers who trusted Xiaomi implicitly and who were desperate for the company to give them more. When rumors began circulating in early 2011 that Xiaomi was developing its own smartphone, a device that would come with MIUI pre-installed, optimized from the ground up for the software that the community had helped create, the forums erupted with anticipation. Users who had gone through the laborious process of flashing MIUI onto phones made by HTC and Samsung and Google were electrified by the possibility of a phone that was built for MIUI, where the software and hardware were designed in concert to deliver an experience that no aftermarket ROM flash could match. The strategic brilliance of this sequencing, software first, community second, hardware third, would become one of the most studied aspects of Xiaomi's early history. Conventional wisdom in the consumer electronics industry held that you built hardware, then developed software for it, then marketed the resulting product to consumers. Xiaomi had inverted every step. They built the software first, discovering what users wanted through a process of radical co-creation. They built the community second, cultivating a passionate base of early adapters who would become the company's most effective marketing channel. And only then, armed with deep product knowledge and a pre-built audience of eager buyers, did they contemplate building hardware. When the moment came to announce a phone, Xiaomi would not be launching into a void. They would be launching to a crowd that was already cheering. The lessons of the MIUI period extended beyond Xiaomi itself, rippling outward through the Chinese technology industry and eventually influencing companies around the world. The concept of fan economics, building a business on the foundation of a deeply engaged community whose members feel ownership over the brand, became a subject of intense study in Chinese business schools. Other smartphone manufacturers, watching Xiaomi's community-driven approach generate passion and loyalty that their own marketing budgets couldn't buy, attempted to replicate elements of the model. Huawei launched its own community forums. Meizu, which had been an early pioneer of fan engagement in China, intensified its efforts. OnePlus, which would launch several years later, would build its entire go-to-market strategy around a community model explicitly inspired by Xiaomi's example, down to an invitation-based system for purchasing its first phone that echoed the exclusivity of MIUI's original 100 Dream sponsors. But none of these imitators quite captured the magic of MIUI's community in its early days, because the magic was inseparable from its timing and its authenticity. MIUI was born at a specific moment in the evolution of the smartphone industry, a moment when Android was dominant but unpolished, when Chinese users were hungry for software that respected their needs, and when the internet had matured just enough to support the kind of rapid, distributed co-creation that Xiaomi's model required. And crucially, the community engagement wasn't a strategy layered on top of a conventional business. It was the business, the product development methodology, the marketing approach, and the company culture all woven into one. You couldn't copy it by adding a forum to your website any more than you could copy Apple by painting your stores white. As 2011 progressed and MIUI's community continued to swell, the project stood as something remarkable in the annals of technology entrepreneurship, a company that had been founded barely a year earlier, that had never sold a physical product, that had no revenue to speak of, and yet commanded the fierce loyalty of hundreds of thousands of users who identified themselves as Mi fans, a term the community had coined for itself and that Xiaomi gratefully adopted. These Mi fans were not passive consumers waiting to be sold to. They were collaborators, advocates, testers, translators, and evangelists who had freely given their time, creativity, and emotional investment to a project they believed in. They had helped transform a simple Android skin into one of the most feature-rich and user-friendly mobile operating systems in the world, and they had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there was a market, a massive, passionate, underserved market for a technology company that treated its users not as targets, but as partners. The foundation was laid, the community was built, the software was refined through hundreds of iterations informed by millions of data points from the most engaged user base any Chinese technology company had ever assembled. All that remained was to give this community what it had been clamoring for, a phone to call its own. The story of MIUI was, in many ways, the overture to everything that followed. The themes established here, the melodies introduced here, the rhythms set in motion would echo through every subsequent chapter of Xiaomi's history. The fan-driven software revolution wasn't just how Xiaomi got its start, it was the template for how Xiaomi would approach every challenge, every market, and every product category it would ever enter. Listen first, build together, iterate relentlessly, and never forget that the people using your products are the most valuable resource you will ever have. The smartphone disruption, MIUI through rapid market ascent, 2011 to 2014. On the evening of August 16, 2011, something extraordinary happened in a Beijing conference hall that would send shockwaves through the global technology industry. Lei Zhan, dressed in his signature dark shirt and jeans, an aesthetic choice that had already drawn comparisons to Steve Jobs, walked onto a sparse stage before an audience of roughly 800 people. Most of them were not journalists or industry analysts. They were fans, MIUI users, forum moderators, and passionate early adopters who had spent the past year testing Xiaomi's custom Android software, filing bug reports, and evangelizing the brand to anyone who would listen. They had been invited to witness the moment their beloved software company would cross the Rubicon into hardware. What Lei Zhan revealed that evening was the MIUI, Xiaomi's first smartphone, and the device that would fundamentally alter the economics of the smartphone industry. The specifications Lei Zhan rattled off that night were, by any measure, extraordinary for a company that had never manufactured a single piece of hardware. The MIUI featured a Qualcomm Snapdragon MSM 8260 dual-core 1.5 GHz processor, 1 GB of RAM, a 4-inch 854 by 480 display with a sharp pixel density, an 8-megapixel rear camera, and a generous 1,930 mAh battery. These were not merely respectable specifications, they were flagship-tier components, matching or exceeding what Samsung, HTC, and Motorola were offering in their premium devices at that moment in time. The Snapdragon MSM 8260 in particular was a coveted chipset that powered phones costing 2 or 3 times what Lei Zhan was about to announce. Then came the price. Lei Zhan paused, letting the moment build. 1,999 yuan. The crowd erupted. At roughly $310 at the time, the MIUI was priced at less than half the cost of competing flagship smartphones in China. The Samsung Galaxy S2, which used a comparable chipset and similar specifications, was selling for approximately 4,500 to 5,000 yuan. HTC's Sensation was in a similar range. Even domestic competitors like Huawei and ZTE, which were beginning to offer Android smartphones, couldn't match Xiaomi's combination of top-tier specs at such an aggressive price point. The applause in that conference hall wasn't polite. It was thunderous, disbelieving, and tinged with the electric energy of people who understood they were witnessing a paradigm shift. But how was this possible? How could a startup with no manufacturing experience, no retail stores, no carrier relationships, and no track record in hardware produce a phone with flagship internals for the price of a mid-ranger? The answer lay in a business model so radical that most industry veterans initially dismissed it as unsustainable, a model that would later be described by Lei Jun himself with the memorable phrase, "We're selling the hardware at essentially cost price." The economics of disruption. The traditional smartphone business model in 2011 was built on layers of margin. A manufacturer like Samsung or HTC would design a phone, contract with component suppliers, oversee manufacturing, and then sell the finished product through a complex distribution chain. National distributors purchased devices from the manufacturer, then sold them to regional distributors, who in turn supplied retail stores. At each step, a margin was added. Carrier partnerships added another layer of complexity and cost, with subsidies tied to contracts that varied by market. Marketing budgets were enormous. Samsung alone would spend billions of dollars annually on advertising. Physical retail presence required real estate, staff, and inventory management. By the time a phone reached a consumer's hands, its price had been inflated by 30 to 50% or more beyond its actual production cost, sometimes significantly more. Lei Jun looked at this structure and saw an industry ripe for disruption. His insight was deceptively simple. What if you stripped away almost every layer of cost between manufacturing and consumer? What if you sold phones exclusively online, eliminating distributors, retail markup, and the need for massive brick-and-mortar infrastructure? What if you spent almost nothing on traditional advertising, relying instead on the passionate community you'd already built through MIUI? What if you kept your hardware margins razor thin, perhaps 5% or less, and planned to eventually monetize users through software services, content, and an ecosystem of connected products? This wasn't theoretical. Xiaomi executed on it with ruthless precision. The Mi 1 was sold exclusively through Xiaomi's own website, mi.com. There were no carrier deals, no retail partners, no shelf space to negotiate for. This alone eliminated an enormous portion of the cost structure. Marketing was handled almost entirely through social media, Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, and the MIUI community forums. Lei Jun himself became the company's most effective marketing tool, personally engaging with fans online, responding to feedback, and cultivating a persona that blended tech geek authenticity with entrepreneurial charisma. Xiaomi's small marketing team focused on creating viral moments rather than buying television airtime. The launch event itself was designed as content, something fans would share, discuss, and argue about across every corner of China's internet. The hardware margins were indeed nearly non-existent. Some analysts later estimated that Xiaomi was selling the Mi 1 at or even slightly below cost, treating the device as a gateway to a broader relationship with the consumer. Lei Jun often compared the model to Amazon's Kindle strategy: sell the hardware cheap, then recoup through services, though Xiaomi's service monetization was still more aspiration than reality in 2011. The bet was long-term: build a massive user base quickly, earn their loyalty, and figure out monetization later. It was a venture capital-backed gamble, and Xiaomi had the funding to sustain it. By the time the Mi 1 launched, the company had raised significant capital from investors including Morningside Venture Capital, Qiming Venture Partners, and IDG Capital, with a subsequent round in late 2011 led by digital titans who saw the potential in Lei Jun's vision. But selling phones at cost through a website required one more crucial innovation, a mechanism that would solve the twin challenges of inventory management and demand generation simultaneously. Xiaomi needed to avoid the catastrophic risk that had killed many hardware startups, being stuck with warehouses full of unsold inventory. At the same time, they needed to manufacture excitement that would compensate for the absence of traditional marketing. The solution was elegant, controversial, and spectacularly effective. It was the flash sale. The flash sale phenomenon. The MIUI went on sale for the first time on September 5, 2011, through Xiaomi's website. It sold out almost instantly. The initial batch, reportedly around 300 units reserved for the first wave, vanished in minutes. Subsequent batches were released in carefully controlled quantities, each announced in advance on social media, each selling out with startling speed. Within months, the MIUI was available only through periodic flash sales, events where tens of thousands of units would be made available at a specific time, with hundreds of thousands or even millions of people simultaneously trying to purchase one. The flash sale model was not entirely Xiaomi's invention. Limited product drops had been used in fashion and gaming, but Xiaomi refined it into an art form tailored specifically to the dynamics of China's internet culture. Each sale was an event. Xiaomi would announce the date and time days in advance, building anticipation through Weibo posts, forum discussions, and countdown timers on their website. Users had to register their interest beforehand, and the numbers were staggering. By late 2012, it was common for hundreds of thousands of people to register for a sale offering only 50,000 or 100,000 units. The disparity between supply and demand was enormous, and whether by design or genuine constraint, the scarcity transforms the MIUI from a budget phone into a coveted object of desire. The psychology was powerful. Scarcity breeds urgency. When you know that a phone might sell out in seconds, the act of purchasing becomes thrilling, a competition, a game, a small victory. Fans who successfully snagged a MIUI during a flash sale felt a rush of accomplishment and shared their triumph on social media. Those who missed out expressed their frustration publicly, which only amplified the perception that these phones were impossibly desirable. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Scarcity created buzz, buzz attracted more potential buyers deepened the scarcity, and the spiral of hype continued upward. Critics accused Xiaomi of manufacturing artificial scarcity, deliberately withholding stock to generate publicity and inflate demand. There was undoubtedly some truth to this charge, though the reality was more nuanced. Xiaomi was genuinely constrained by its manufacturing capabilities. As a startup without its own factories, it relied on contract manufacturers like Foxconn and Inventec, and securing production capacity was a constant negotiation. Qualcomm's chip supply was another bottleneck. Lei Zhan's team couldn't simply order 10 million units and hope they'd sell. By producing in controlled batches and selling through flash sales, Xiaomi could match production to proven demand, minimizing the inventory risk that had destroyed countless hardware companies. The flash sale model was simultaneously a marketing strategy and a supply chain survival mechanism. Whatever the precise balance of strategy and necessity, the results were undeniable. The MIUI sold approximately 7.2 million units over its lifetime, an astonishing number for a debut product from an unknown hardware brand. To put this in perspective, many established Chinese phone brands at the time would have been thrilled with such numbers for any single model. Xiaomi had achieved it with zero retail presence, essentially zero traditional advertising spend, and a team that was still small enough to fit in a single office floor. The company had proven that its model worked, that there was a vast, hungry Chinese consumers who wanted flagship performance without flagship prices, and who were willing to navigate the frustrations of flash sales to get it. Me Too, cementing the formula. If the MIUI was Xiaomi's proof of concept, the Me Too was its declaration of intent. Announced in August 2012 at a larger, more polished event that echoed the growing confidence within the company, the Me Too represented a significant leap in specifications while maintaining the same aggressive pricing philosophy. It featured a Qualcomm Snapdragon APQ8604 quad-core processor, one of the first phones anywhere in the world to use this chipset, along with 2 gigabytes of RAM, a 4.3-inch 720p IPS display, a 13-megapixel camera, and ran MIUI v4 based on Android 4.1 Jelly Bean. Once again, these were specifications that matched or exceeded what Samsung and HTC were offering in their premium flagships, yet the price remained at 1,999 yuan. The launch timing was critical. Xiaomi announced the Mi 2 on August 16, 2012, exactly 1 year after the Mi 1's unveiling, establishing an annual release cadence that would become a key part of the brand's rhythm. This annual flagship cycle gave fans something to anticipate, tech media something to cover, and the company a regular drumbeat of attention that kept Xiaomi perpetually in the conversation. The Mi 2 improved on its predecessor in every meaningful dimension, but perhaps its most important upgrade was in the manufacturing and supply chain. Xiaomi had learned hard lessons from the Mi 1's supply constraints and invested heavily in strengthening its relationships with contract manufacturers and component suppliers. While flash sales continued to sell out, the company was able to ramp production more quickly and fulfill demand more efficiently. The Mi 2, along with its subsequent variants, the Mi 2A with a slightly smaller screen and the Mi 2S with an upgraded Snapdragon 600 processor, would go on to sell over 10 million units combined, cementing Xiaomi's position as a genuine force in the Chinese smartphone market. The Mi 2S variant, released in April 2013, deserves particular mention. By upgrading the processor to the Snapdragon 600, the same chip powering Samsung's Galaxy S4, the undisputed Android flagship of that moment, while keeping the price at 1,999 yuan, Xiaomi made its value proposition almost obscenely compelling. A consumer walking into a Samsung store in China would see the Galaxy S4 priced at roughly 5,000 yuan. Then they could go online and order a Xiaomi Mi 2S with the same processor, comparable specs, and a vibrant software experience for less than half the price. For millions of Chinese consumers, particularly young professionals, students, and the growing middle class, the choice was obvious. The Redmi Revolution. In the summer of 2013, Xiaomi made a move that would dramatically expand its addressable market and accelerate its trajectory toward market dominance. On July 31st, Lei Jun took the stage to announce a new sub-brand, Hongmi, known internationally as Redmi. If the Mi series represented flagship performance at mid-range prices, Redmi represented solid mid-range performance at entry-level prices. The original Redmi, priced at just 799 yuan, approximately $130, featured a MediaTek MT6589 quad-core processor, a 4.7-inch 720p display, 1 gigabyte of RAM, and an 8-megapixel camera. For less than a third of what Samsung charged for its flagship and less than half of what the Mi series cost, Chinese consumers could now get a genuinely capable smartphone with Xiaomi's polished MIUI software experience. The Redmi was a strategic masterstroke. China's smartphone market in 2013 was undergoing a massive expansion, driven by the rapid build-out of 3G and emerging 4G networks, particularly in second, third, and fourth-tier cities. Hundreds of millions of Chinese consumers were upgrading from feature phones to smartphones for the first time, and price sensitivity in this demographic was acute. Samsung's budget offerings were mediocre, HTC was struggling, and Chinese brands like Lenovo, Huawei, ZTE, and Coolpad were competing fiercely in the sub-1,000 yuan segment with devices of variable quality. The Redmi, backed by Xiaomi's growing brand cachet, vibrant software, and fan community, immediately stood out. The impact was explosive. The first Redmi flash sale on QQ a partnership with Tencent that gave Xiaomi access to one of China's largest social platforms, attracted over 7.45 million reservations for 100,000 units. The phones sold out in 90 seconds. Subsequent sales were equally frenzied. By the end of 2013, Redmi had sold approximately 18 million units, a staggering number that by itself would have made it one of China's best-selling phone models of the year. Combined with Mi series sales, Xiaomi sold a total of approximately 18.7 million smartphones in 2013, a 160% increase over its 2012 figure of approximately 7.2 million units, and a quantum leap from the roughly 3 million devices it had shipped in the second half of 2011 and early 2012. The Redmi line did more than just drive volume. It fundamentally changed who Xiaomi's customers were. The Mi series had attracted tech enthusiasts, gadget aficionados, and young urban professionals, people who understood processor benchmarks and appreciated MIUI's customization options. Redmi brought in a much broader demographic: students on tight budgets, blue-collar workers, older consumers making their first smartphone purchase, and residents of smaller cities where even 1,999 yuan felt like a significant expenditure. This broadening of the customer base was essential to Xiaomi's ambitions. Lei Jun wasn't building a niche brand for enthusiasts. He was building a mass-market technology company, and Redmi was the vehicle that would carry Xiaomi from the tech-savvy margins into the mainstream heart of the Chinese consumer market. The creation of the Redmi sub-brand also revealed something important about Xiaomi's thinking. By keeping Redmi distinct from the Mi series, the company could pursue volume at the low end without diluting the aspirational quality of its flagship line. A Mi phone buyer could still feel they were getting something special, a flagship killer, as the emerging terminology had it, while Redmi buyers were getting the best possible phone for their budget. This dual brand strategy, which would evolve and expand over the years, allowed Xiaomi to compete across multiple price segments simultaneously, without the brand confusion that plagued competitors who tried to stretch a single brand from budget to premium. The financial implications were equally remarkable. In 2013, Xiaomi's revenue surged to approximately 26.6 billion yuan, roughly $4.3 billion, nearly tripling the previous year's figure. The company was still private, but in August 2013, it raised a round of funding that valued it at $10 billion, making it one of the most valuable technology startups in the world. For a company that had shipped its first phone less than 2 years earlier, this was an almost surreal trajectory, and it attracted intense scrutiny from investors, competitors, and the media alike. Analysts debated whether Xiaomi's model was sustainable, whether its razor-thin hardware margins could support a real business, and whether its online-only sales channel imposed a natural ceiling on growth. Lei Jun had answers for all of these questions, and 2014 would become the year when those answers were tested and validated on a scale that few had predicted. The year 2014 was, by any reasonable measure, the crescendo of Xiaomi's initial smartphone ascent, a 12-month period so dizzying in its pace and scale that it cemented the company's reputation as the most disruptive force in the global smartphone industry. It began with the Mi 3, which had been launched in late 2013 and continued selling briskly into the new year. The Mi 3 was the most refined flagship Xiaomi had yet produced, a phone that featured Qualcomm's Snapdragon 800 processor, or NVIDIA's Tegra 4 in the WCDMA variant, a 5-inch 1080p IPS display, 2 GB of RAM, a 13-megapixel Sony camera sensor, and a design that, for the first time, felt genuinely premium rather than merely competent. Its unibody polycarbonate shell, available in multiple colors, gave the phone a sleek, monolithic appearance that moved beyond the functional but uninspired aesthetics of the Mi 1 and Mi 2. At 1,999 yuan, it was the same price as every Mi flagship before it. That number had become almost sacred, a psychological anchor that consumers could rely on, and it offered specifications that genuinely rivaled phones costing 2 or 3 times as much from Samsung, LG, and Sony. But the Mi 3 was merely the steady bass note underneath a symphony of product launches, strategic moves, and explosive growth that defined 2014. In March, Xiaomi unveiled the Redmi Note, extending the Redmi line into the larger screen phablet segment that was surging in popularity across Asia. Priced at just 799 yuan for the base model, the Redmi Note featured a 5.5-inch 720p display, a MediaTek octa-core processor, and 2 GB of RAM, specifications that would have been flagship grade barely 18 months earlier. The Redmi Note was aimed squarely at a massive and underserved market segment, consumers who wanted a large-screen media consumption device but couldn't afford Samsung's Galaxy Note series, which commanded prices of 3,000 to 5,000 yuan. In its first flash sale, the Redmi Note attracted 15 million registrations. 15 million people vying for a chance to buy a phone that cost less than a nice dinner for two in Shanghai. The numbers had become so large that they almost defied comprehension, and they underscored a truth that Xiaomi's competitors were only beginning to grasp. In a market of 1.3 billion people undergoing the fastest smartphone adoption in human history, the company that could deliver the most value at the lowest price while maintaining an emotional connection with its customers would unlock demand of virtually limitless scale. In July 2014, Xiaomi launched the Mi 4, and with it, the company made its most ambitious statement yet about its design aspirations. The Mi 4 was a beautiful device. Where previous Mi phones had been competent but utilitarian in their physical design, the Mi 4 featured a stainless steel metal frame with chamfered edges that caught the light like jewelry. The back panel, while still plastic, came in a variety of textured finishes, wood grain, leather, bamboo, stone, that gave the phone a tactile personality its predecessors had lacked. A piece of steel art, Lei Jun called it during the launch event, a tagline that simultaneously communicated the company's design ambitions and, to critics, invited comparisons with Apple that Xiaomi wasn't yet ready to sustain. The phone's internals were predictably impressive for the price: a Snapdragon 801 processor, 3 GB of RAM, a 13-megapixel camera with improved optical image stabilization, and a 5-inch 1080p display, all for the ritual price of 1,999 yuan. The launch event itself, held at Beijing's National Convention Center, was a spectacle that revealed how thoroughly Xiaomi had absorbed and adapted the playbook of technology theater. Lei Jun, dressed in his characteristic dark t-shirt and jeans, an aesthetic choice that earned him the nickname Chinese Steve Jobs, a comparison he publicly deflected but privately seemed to appreciate, delivered a keynote presentation that was part product demo, part motivational speech, and part rock concert. The audience of Mi fans cheered, chanted, and waved orange glow sticks. It was a far cry from the understated gathering of 100 fans who had attended the Mi 1's soft launch 3 years earlier, and it demonstrated how successfully Xiaomi had cultivated not just a customer base, but a genuine cultural movement. The comparison to Apple, however, cut both ways, and in 2014, it became one of the most contentious narratives surrounding Xiaomi's rise. The resemblance between Lei Jun's presentation style and Steve Jobs was only the most visible element of a broader pattern that critics eagerly cataloged. Xiaomi's retail boxes were minimalist white. Its marketing aesthetic was clean and product-focused. Its MIUI software had originally drawn heavily from iOS design conventions, and its online store experience, with its emphasis on storytelling, lifestyle imagery, and a curated product selection, felt unmistakably Apple-influenced. When Apple's lead designer, Jony Ive, was asked about Chinese companies copying Apple's designs, he called it theft and said it was lazy. While he didn't name Xiaomi specifically, the context was clear to everyone listening. Hugo Barra, Xiaomi's international vice president, who had been recruited from Google in 2013, pushed back forcefully, arguing that Xiaomi's innovation lay in its business model, its community engagement, and its software, rather than in any single hardware design element. And there was truth in this defense. The flash sale model, the weekly MIUI updates, the Me community forums, the fan-driven product development process, the razor-thin margins offset by software and services revenue, none of these had been copied from Apple. They were genuinely novel approaches, forged in the specific competitive environment of the Chinese technology market. But the design similarities were real enough to fuel ongoing debate and to plant seeds of skepticism in Western media coverage that would shadow Xiaomi's brand for years to come. The copycat narrative, though, did little to slow Xiaomi's momentum in its home market. The numbers for 2014 were simply breathtaking. In the first half of the year alone, Xiaomi sold 26.1 million smartphones, already surpassing its entire 2013 total. By year's end, the company had shipped 61.12 million smartphones, a 227% increase over 2013, and a figure that made Xiaomi the #1 smartphone vendor in China, surpassing Samsung, which had held the crown for years. Samsung's China shipments actually declined in 2014, squeezed from above by Apple's enduring premium appeal and from below by Xiaomi's relentless value proposition. Xiaomi's ascent to the top of the world's largest smartphone market in just 3 years of selling phones was an achievement without parallel in the industry's history. Even Samsung's own meteoric rise in the global smartphone market had taken considerably longer. Revenue followed the trajectory of shipments. Xiaomi's full-year revenue for 2014 reached approximately 74.3 billion yuan, roughly $12 billion, nearly tripling from the previous year. In December 2014, the company closed a monumental funding round that valued it at $45 billion, making it the most valuable technology startup in the world at the time, ahead of Uber, Airbnb, and Palantir. The $45 billion valuation represented an almost unimaginable appreciation from the company's initial founding in 2010, when the combined investment of its 8 co-founders totaled a modest sum. For Lei Jun, who had been building, advising, and investing in technology companies since the 1990s, this validation was deeply personal. Xiaomi wasn't just a successful company, it was the definitive proof of concept for the business philosophy he had been refining for over 2 decades, that the internet could fundamentally restructure traditional industries by eliminating inefficiencies, that putting users first wasn't just good ethics, but good economics, and that a company built on genuine fan loyalty could achieve things that no amount of advertising spend could replicate. But the $45 billion valuation also created expectations that would prove extraordinarily difficult to meet. And within the triumph of 2014 lay the subtle seeds of challenges to come. Xiaomi's online-only sales model, which had been a brilliant innovation in 2011 when smartphone penetration in China was still low and e-commerce was exploding, was beginning to show its limitations. China's online smartphone sales represented only about 20% of the total market. The vast majority of phones were still sold in physical retail stores, carrier shops, and the sprawling electronics bazaars that dotted every Chinese city. Xiaomi's competitors, particularly Huawei with its extensive carrier relationships and tens of thousands of retail points of sale, and the emerging duo of Oppo and Vivo, which were building massive offline distribution networks in smaller cities and rural areas, had access to the 80% of the market that Xiaomi's model couldn't efficiently reach. In 2014, this limitation was masked by the sheer velocity of Xiaomi's online growth, but it would become a much more pressing concern in the years ahead. There were operational challenges too. Xiaomi's flash sale model, while brilliant as a demand generation mechanism, was partly a reflection of genuine supply constraints. The company's lean operations and limited capital, relative to giants like Samsung and Huawei, meant that it often couldn't manufacture phones fast enough to meet demand. For fans who had successfully purchased phones in flash sales, this scarcity enhanced the sense of exclusivity. But for the millions who repeatedly tried and failed to secure a device, refreshing web pages frantically as stock sold out in seconds, the experience was deeply frustrating. A cottage industry of scalpers emerged, buying Xiaomi phones in bulk during flash sales and reselling them at markups of 200 to 500 yuan. The existence of a gray market for phones that were supposed to be the cheapest in their class was a testament to Xiaomi's demand generation prowess, but it also meant that many consumers were paying more than the advertised price, undermining the value proposition that was core to Xiaomi's brand promise. The competitive landscape was also shifting beneath Xiaomi's feet, even as the company stood at its zenith. Huawei, China's largest telecommunications equipment maker, was investing billions in its consumer electronics division and beginning to produce smartphones that matched Xiaomi's specifications at comparable prices. More critically, Huawei was developing its own Kirin line of mobile processors through its HiSilicon subsidiary, giving it a vertical integration advantage that Xiaomi, which relied on Qualcomm and MediaTek for its chips, couldn't match. Meanwhile, Oppo and Vivo, sister companies backed by the enigmatic billionaire Duan Yongping, were pursuing a strategy that was almost the mirror image of Xiaomi's. Where Xiaomi sold online and spent nothing on traditional advertising, Oppo and Vivo blanketed Chinese television with celebrity endorsements and maintained a physical retail presence so ubiquitous that their distinctive green and blue storefronts seemed to appear on every other street corner in Chinese cities of all sizes. They were especially strong in the lower-tier cities and rural areas where Xiaomi's online-focused strategy was weakest, and their phones, while offering less raw performance per yuan than Xiaomi's, were marketed with a lifestyle appeal that resonated with consumers who didn't care about processor benchmarks but did care about camera quality, design aesthetics, and the reassurance of buying from a friendly face in a physical store. None of this was immediately apparent to the outside world in late 2014, when Xiaomi's narrative was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. The company had gone from zero to China's #1 smartphone brand in 3.5 years. It had sold over 61 million phones. It was valued at $45 billion. Its founder was being compared to Steve Jobs and Jack Ma. Its business model was being studied at Harvard Business School and replicated, with varying degrees of success, by dozens of startups across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Hugo Barra's recruitment from Google had given Xiaomi a credibility in Western technology circles that no Chinese smartphone brand had previously achieved, and the company was beginning to make its first tentative forays into international markets. For the Mi fans, that passionate, vocal, loyal community that had been there from the beginning, that had tested early MIUI builds on their phones, that had posted bug reports at 2 in the morning, that had stood in lines at pop-up events and evangelized the brand to anyone who would listen, the triumph of 2014 felt earned and personal. They hadn't just bought phones. They had participated in the creation of something genuinely new, a technology company that listened to them, that valued their opinions, that treated them not as consumers to be marketed at, but as partners in a shared endeavor. When Lei Jun took the stage at the Mi 4 launch event and the crowd erupted in cheers, the emotion in the room was real and palpable. These were people who felt ownership over Xiaomi's success, and in a very real sense, they were right to feel that way. The story of Xiaomi's smartphone disruption from 2011 to 2014 is ultimately a story about the power of alignment, of getting the right product, the right price, the right distribution model, and the right brand narrative to converge at the right moment in a market's evolution. China, in those years, was experiencing the single largest wave of smartphone adoption the world had ever seen, and Xiaomi rode that wave with a combination of strategic brilliance, operational audacity, and genuine idealism that no competitor could match. The Mi 1 had proven the concept. The Mi 2 had built the brand. The Red Mi had unlocked the mass market. The Mi 3 and Mi 4 had solidified Xiaomi's flagship credentials, and through it all, the flash sales, the fan community, the weekly software updates, and the relentless focus on value had created a flywheel of growth that seemed, at the end of 2014, as if it might spin forever. It wouldn't, of course. No company's trajectory is a straight line, and the very speed of Xiaomi's ascent had created vulnerabilities that would soon be tested. But that reckoning lay in the future. In the golden glow of late 2014, what Xiaomi had accomplished was undeniable. A small team of dreamers, armed with a radical business model and an unshakable faith in the power of community, had stormed the gates of one of the world's most competitive industries, and against all reasonable expectations, conquered it. The smartphone disruption was complete. The question now was what Lei Zhan and his team would build upon its foundations. Building the ecosystem, the Internet of Things and Lifestyle Empire, 2013 to 2018. In the summer of 2013, Lei Zhan sat in a conference room at Xiaomi's Beijing headquarters, staring at a whiteboard covered in concentric circles. At the center was a smartphone. Radiating outward were lines connecting to dozens of product categories, some familiar like headphones and portable chargers, and others that seemed almost absurdly ambitious for a company that had been making phones for barely 2 years. Air purifiers, rice cookers, electric scooters, suitcases, even towels. His co-founders exchanged glances. The smartphone business was booming. Xiaomi had just become China's fastest-growing phone brand, and the temptation to simply ride that wave to ever greater heights was immense. But Lei Zhan had been thinking about something bigger. He had been studying a pattern that haunted him, the rise and fall of companies that defined themselves by a single product line. He had watched Nokia crumble, seen BlackBerry wither, and knew that hardware margins in smartphones would inevitably compress towards zero. The smartphone, he believed, was not the destination, it was the gateway. What Lei Zhan sketched on that whiteboard would become one of the most audacious business experiments in modern technology history, the Xiaomi ecosystem, a constellation of startups and product companies orbiting around Xiaomi's platform, collectively building an Internet of Things empire that would eventually encompass hundreds of product categories and connect hundreds of millions of devices. It was a vision that borrowed from disparate inspirations: the curated minimalism of Muji, the supply chain mastery of Apple, the diversified conglomerate logic of Samsung, and the platform dynamics of Amazon, yet synthesized them into something genuinely new. And it would begin, of all places, with a humble power bank. The seed: why power banks changed everything. Liu Dai was the man Lei Zhan tapped to lead the ecosystem initiative. A co-founder of Xiaomi and a former industrial design professor at the Beijing University of Science and Technology, Liu Dai possessed a rare combination of aesthetic sensibility and engineering pragmatism. His mandate was deceptively simple: identify product categories where Chinese consumers were underserved, find or incubate startups capable of making dramatically better products, and use Xiaomi's brand, supply chain expertise, and sales channels to bring those products to market at prices that would stun the competition. The first target was the portable power bank. In 2013, China's power bank market was a chaotic mess. Hundreds of manufacturers churned out products of wildly varying quality, many using recycled laptop batteries of dubious safety wrapped in cheap plastic housings. A decent 10,000 mAh power bank from a reputable brand cost between 150 and 200 yuan. The products were ugly, unreliable, and occasionally dangerous. Lei Zhan and Liu Dai saw an opportunity that was almost too perfect. A product category ripe for disruption, with fragmented competition, low barriers to entry in terms of core technology, and a massive addressable market of smartphone users perpetually anxious about battery life. In late 2013, Xiaomi invested in a small company called Xiaomi. Xiaomi's design team worked closely with Xiaomi to develop a power bank that was, by the standards of the time, a small revelation. It used high-quality lithium-ion cells sourced from LG and Samsung, the same cells used in Tesla's battery packs. It was wrapped in an anodized aluminum housing that felt cool and substantial in the hand. It held 10,400 mAh of charge, and it was priced at 69 yuan, roughly $10, less than half the price of competing products with inferior specifications. When the Mi power bank launched in early 2014, it detonated a bomb in the market. Xiaomi sold 1 million units in the first 3 months. Within a year, Xiaomi had shipped over 20 million power banks, making it the largest power bank manufacturer in the world by volume. Competitors were devastated. The low price wasn't a loss leader. Through ruthless supply chain optimization and the elimination of traditional retail margins, the product was sold exclusively through Xiaomi's online channels. Xiaomi eked out a thin but real profit on every unit. Hundreds of smaller power bank manufacturers simply went out of business, unable to compete on quality, price, or brand recognition simultaneously. The power bank was proof of concept. It demonstrated that the Xiaomi model, combining startup agility with Xiaomi's brand halo, design DNA, supply chain leverage, and direct-to-consumer distribution, could be replicated across product categories far beyond smartphones. But more than that, it revealed something about the psychology of Xiaomi's customer base. Fans who trusted Xiaomi for their phones were willing, even eager, to trust the brand for other products. The power bank wasn't just a profitable accessory, it was a bridge, carrying Xiaomi's reputation from the digital world into the physical one. The bamboo forest, Xiaomi's incubation model. Lei Jun often described the ecosystem strategy using a botanical metaphor. Xiaomi, he said, would not be a single tree growing ever taller, vulnerable to storms, limited by its own root structure. Instead, Xiaomi would be a bamboo forest, with each shoot drawing from a shared root system but growing independently, flexible and resilient. If one shoot was damaged, the others would continue to thrive. The root system was Xiaomi's platform, its brand, its user base, its online sales infrastructure, its MIUI operating system, which would serve as the connective tissue between devices, and increasingly its growing network of physical retail stores. The organizational model Liu De designed was extraordinarily deliberate. Xiaomi would not build these ecosystem products internally. That would be too slow, too bureaucratic, and would dilute the company's focus on its core smartphone and software business. Instead, Xiaomi would identify promising startups, or in many cases, recruit talented engineers and designers to found new ones, and take minority equity stakes, typically ranging from 20% to 40%. These ecosystem companies, or shengtai lian qiye, would remain independent with their own management teams, their own equity structures, and their own entrepreneurial culture, but they would receive from Xiaomi something far more valuable than capital alone. First, Xiaomi provided design and product definition support. Liu De's team worked with ecosystem companies to ensure that their products adhered to Xiaomi's design language, clean, minimalist, and instantly recognizable. The aesthetic consistency was striking. Whether it was a fitness band, an air purifier, or a set of screwdrivers, a Xiaomi ecosystem product looked like it belonged in the same family. The design team would often go through dozens of iterations, pushing startup founders to eliminate unnecessary buttons, simplify packaging, and obsess over the kind of details that transformed commodity products into objects of desire. Second, Xiaomi offered its supply chain muscle. Many of the ecosystem companies were small startups that would have struggled to negotiate favorable terms with component suppliers. Through Xiaomi's purchasing power and supplier relationships, they gained access to higher quality materials at lower costs. The aluminum for the power bank housing, the OLED screens for the fitness bands, the HEPA filters for the air purifiers, all benefited from Xiaomi's ability to aggregate demand and negotiate at scale. Third, and perhaps most critically, Xiaomi provided distribution. Products that met Xiaomi's quality and design standards were sold through Xiaomi's own channels, its website, its app, and eventually its Mi Home retail stores under the Mi or Mijia brand names. For a young startup, this was transformative. Instead of spending years and millions of yuan building a brand and a sales network from scratch, an ecosystem company could go from prototype to mass market product in months, reaching Xiaomi's enormous and fiercely loyal customer base directly. The economics were elegant. Xiaomi would earn revenue through its equity stakes, through margins on products sold through its channels, and through the broader strategic benefit of keeping users within the Xiaomi ecosystem, making Xiaomi smartphones more valuable because they could control an expanding universe of connected devices. The ecosystem companies, meanwhile, gained the advantages of being part of a large platform while retaining the speed, hunger, and equity upside of independent startups. It was, in many ways, the best of both worlds. By 2014, Liu De's team was running at full sprint. They were evaluating dozens of potential investments per month, applying a rigorous framework. The ideal ecosystem product met several criteria. It existed in a large but fragmented market with no dominant brand. It was ripe for quality improvement and design innovation. It could be sold at a dramatically lower price point through supply chain optimization and direct sales, and it had some potential, however indirect, to connect to the smartphone-centric IoT vision. Not every product needed to be smart or internet-connected, at least not yet. But every product needed to strengthen the gravitational pull of the Xiaomi universe. From wearables to living rooms, the ecosystem expands. The second major ecosystem hit came in the wearables category, and it would prove even more consequential than the power bank. In 2014, Xiaomi invested in Xiaomi, a Hefei-based company founded by Huang Wang, a serial entrepreneur with deep expertise in wearable technology. The mission was to create a fitness band that could compete with products from Fitbit, Jawbone, and Nike, which at the time were priced between $99 and $149 at a fraction of the cost. The Mi Band, launched in July 2014, was a masterclass in strategic product design. It was a simple silicone wristband with a tiny embedded capsule that tracked steps, sleep, and incoming phone calls. It had no screen, just 3 LED indicator lights. It was water-resistant, and its battery lasted an astonishing 30 days on a single charge, at a time when most competitors barely managed a week. And it was priced at 79 yuan, approximately $13. The tech press was initially dismissive. How could a $13 fitness band be any good? But consumers voted with their wallets. The Mi Band sold 1 million units in its first 3 months. By the end of 2015, Xiaomi had shipped over 10 million units, making the Mi Band the world's second best-selling wearable device, behind only Apple Watch, a product that cost 20 times as much. The Mi Band didn't just democratize fitness tracking, it redefined the market's price expectations and forced established players into an agonizing choice between maintaining margins and maintaining market share. What made the Mi Band strategically significant went beyond unit sales. It was one of the first ecosystem products that created a persistent data connection to the user's smartphone. Through the Mi Fit app, users synced their activity data daily, creating a habit loop that deepened their engagement with Xiaomi's software platform. The fitness band was a Trojan horse, a tiny, inexpensive device that wove itself into the daily rhythms of millions of lives, generating data, building loyalty, and making it just a little bit harder to leave the Xiaomi ecosystem. The air purifier was the product that signaled Xiaomi's ambitions had moved from personal accessories into the living room. In December 2014, Xiaomi launched the Mi Air Purifier, created by an ecosystem company called SmartMi, founded by Su Jun, a former Motorola engineer. China's air pollution crisis was at its peak. Cities like Beijing routinely experienced air quality index readings above 500, a level classified as hazardous. Air purifiers had become essential appliances for urban Chinese families. But the market was dominated by foreign brands like Blue Air, IQ Air, and Philips, whose products were effective but expensive, often costing 3,000 to 8,000 yuan. The Mi air purifier delivered CADR performance comparable to products costing 3 to 4 times more, wrapped in a sleek white tower that looked like it had been designed in Cupertino. It could be controlled via smartphone, and it was priced at 899 yuan, roughly $145. The reaction from incumbents was one of barely concealed panic. Blue Air's China head publicly questioned how Xiaomi could possibly be making money at that price point. The answer was the same as it had always been: ruthless component sourcing, efficient manufacturing, zero retail markup, and a willingness to accept razor-thin hardware margins in exchange for ecosystem expansion and long-term user value. The air purifier also represented a philosophical evolution. The power bank was a smartphone accessory. Its relationship to Xiaomi's core product was obvious and direct. The Fitness Band had a data connection to the phone, but the air purifier was a home appliance. Its connection to smartphones was real but secondary. By entering this category, Xiaomi was declaring that its ambitions extended to every corner of daily life. The smartphone was still the remote control, the hub through which users managed their expanding collection of Xiaomi devices. But the products themselves were becoming ends in their own right, useful, beautiful objects that improved people's lives regardless of what phone they carried. Through 2015 and into 2016, the ecosystem portfolio exploded in scope. Xiaomi-backed companies launched smart cameras, robot vacuums, water purifiers, electric rice cookers, smart lighting systems, bathroom scales, blood pressure monitors, bedside lamps, and even an electric scooter, the Ninebot, created through an ecosystem investment that dramatically democratized personal electric transportation. Each product followed the same playbook: identify a bloated, complacent category, partner with a hungry startup, apply Xiaomi's design rigor and supply chain expertise, price aggressively, sell direct. The consistency of execution was remarkable. Product after product landed in the market like a series of controlled demolitions, collapsing price points and reshaping consumer expectations. What made the ecosystem genuinely revolutionary, what distinguished it from a mere collection of cheap gadgets, was the invisible architecture that held it all together. Behind every smart lamp, every rice cooker, every robot vacuum was a unifying philosophy of interconnection that Xiaomi had been quietly building since the earliest days of the ecosystem program. The Mi Home app, which launched in its mature form in 2016, became the nervous system of this sprawling empire. Through it, users could control dozens of different devices from different ecosystem companies, set automated routines, monitor energy consumption, and create scenes. Good Morning might simultaneously open the curtains, start the coffee maker, turn on the bathroom light, and read the day's weather forecast. This was not a theoretical vision presented on a conference stage. It was a lived reality in millions of Chinese homes, functioning with a reliability and simplicity that made competitors' smart home offerings feel cobbled together by comparison. The technical foundation of this interoperability was a set of strict protocols and standards that Xiaomi imposed on every ecosystem company. When a startup joined the ecosystem, it didn't just receive money and distribution. It received a comprehensive design language, a connectivity framework, and a set of non-negotiable requirements for how its product would communicate with the broader Xiaomi network. The company developed its own IoT connectivity module, a tiny, low-cost chip that could be embedded in virtually any device, enabling Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connectivity and integration with the Mi Home platform. By standardizing this module across hundreds of products from dozens of different companies, Xiaomi achieved something that the fragmented Western smart home market, with its competing protocols, incompatible apps, and balkanized ecosystems from Google, Amazon, Apple, and Samsung, struggled to replicate: a Xiaomi user could walk into a store, buy a smart plug from Xiaomi, a light bulb from Yeelight, a camera from Yi Technology, and a humidifier from SmartMe, and every single one would appear in the same app, speak the same language, and play nicely together right out of the box. This seamlessness was not accidental. It was the product of Liu Day's relentless insistence on coherence. He and his team reviewed every product that carried the Xiaomi or Mi ecosystem branding, not just for quality and pricing, but for how gracefully it integrated into the larger family. There were stories within the ecosystem companies of products being sent back multiple times, not because they were defective, but because the shade of white was slightly off, or the indicator light was too bright, or the sound the device made when powered on didn't harmonize with the audio signatures of other Xiaomi products. This obsessiveness created a visual and experiential consistency across the ecosystem that was almost eerie. Walk into a Xiaomi-heavy apartment, and every device looked like it belonged together, as if a single designer had laid out the entire home. The white and gray palette, the minimal lines, the absence of unnecessary buttons, it was Muji meets Apple, democratized and distributed across hundreds of product categories. The financial architecture behind the ecosystem was equally elegant, and it revealed Lei Jun's sophistication as both a strategist and an investor. Xiaomi typically took equity stakes of between 20 and 40% in its ecosystem companies, enough to exert significant influence without full ownership. This meant that each company retained its entrepreneurial energy. Its founders were still building their startup, still driven by the hunger and urgency that comes with ownership. But Xiaomi provided something no venture capital firm could match, a distribution machine that could take a product from prototype to millions of units sold in months. The ecosystem companies gained access to Xiaomi's online store, Mi.com, which had grown into one of China's top e-commerce platforms, its social media marketing apparatus, its supply chain relationships, and its massive user base. In return, Xiaomi gained revenue from product sales, equity appreciation as the companies grew, and most importantly, deepening user engagement with its platform. The numbers told a staggering story. By the end of 2017, Xiaomi's IoT platform had connected over 85 million devices, excluding smartphones and laptops, making it, by some measures, the world's largest consumer IoT platform. The ecosystem's revenue had grown from virtually nothing in 2014 to over 23 billion won, approximately $3.5 billion in 2017, representing roughly a fifth of Xiaomi's total revenue. More than 20 ecosystem companies had each achieved annual revenues exceeding 100 million won. Several had grown into unicorns in their own right. Xiaomi, the maker of the Mi Band, went public on the New York Stock Exchange in February 2018 with a valuation exceeding $600 million. Ninebot merged with Segway, the iconic American personal transportation company, in a deal that saw a Xiaomi ecosystem startup swallow a Western pioneer. Roborock, the robot vacuum maker, was on a trajectory toward its own public listing. The ecosystem had become a factory for creating successful companies, each one simultaneously independent and symbiotic, a coral reef of enterprise built around Xiaomi's central platform. But the ecosystem strategy also carried risks and tensions that became more visible as the network grew. Some ecosystem companies chafed under Xiaomi's influence, particularly the requirement to keep prices low. Founders who had built genuinely innovative products sometimes felt that Xiaomi's pricing pressure left them with margins too thin to invest adequately in R&D or build their own brands. The relationship was symbiotic, but the power was not symmetrical. Xiaomi controlled distribution, branding, and platform access, which gave it enormous leverage. Some ecosystem companies began launching products under their own brands in parallel, seeking to capture higher margins outside Xiaomi's gravitational pull. Yeelight, for instance, began selling premium lighting products under its own name, priced significantly higher than the Xiaomi branded versions. Xiaomi launched its own Amazfit brand of smartwatches, eventually growing Amazfit into a business that rivaled or exceeded its Xiaomi contracted production. This was not necessarily a crisis. Lei Jun had always envisioned the ecosystem companies as independent entities, but it introduced competitive dynamics within the network that required careful management. There was also the question of quality control at scale. By 2017, there were over 90 ecosystem companies producing hundreds of different products. Maintaining the meticulous quality standards that had characterized the earliest launches became exponentially harder as the network expanded. Not every ecosystem product was a masterpiece. Some, a handful of kitchen gadgets, certain accessories, felt rushed or underdeveloped. The occasional misfire was perhaps inevitable in a portfolio this vast, but each one risked diluting the brand equity that Xiaomi had painstakingly built. The company responded by tightening its quality review processes and creating tiered branding. Some products carried the Mi brand directly, signifying the highest level of Xiaomi involvement, while others were sold under the Mijia sub-brand, and still others under the ecosystem company's own name with a small Mi ecosystem badge. This tiering gave Xiaomi a way to extend its ecosystem without putting its primary brand on every product, a sophisticated brand architecture that most Chinese technology companies of that era had not yet attempted. The Mijia brand, launched formally in 2016, deserves particular attention. Short for Mi Smart Home, Mijia literally translates to Mi Home. It became the umbrella under which Xiaomi's most ambitious lifestyle products lived. The Mijia IH rice cooker, launched in March 2016 at 999 yuan, became a cultural moment in its own right. Rice cookers were deeply personal objects in Chinese households, and the best ones, made by Japanese brands like Zojirushi, Tiger, and Panasonic, had become status symbols, priced at 2,000 to 5,000 yuan. Chinese tourists were infamous for buying Japanese rice cookers by the suitcase load during trips to Tokyo and Osaka, a phenomenon that became a symbol of China's manufacturing insecurity. The feeling that the country could build smartphones and skyscrapers, but not a rice cooker worthy of its own cuisine. The Mijia rice cooker was designed to change that narrative. It used induction heating technology, featured a cast iron inner pot, and was tuned by a Japanese rice cooking expert. It was, by most reviewers' assessments, genuinely excellent, competitive with Japanese products, costing 3 to 5 times more. Lei Jun personally promoted it with visible pride, framing it not just as a product launch, but as a statement about what Chinese manufacturing could achieve when ambition met discipline. The rice cooker illuminated something essential about Xiaomi's ecosystem philosophy. It wasn't just about technology, it was about dignity, about the idea that beautifully designed, high-quality products should not be the exclusive province of the wealthy. This was a message that resonated deeply in China's emerging middle class. Hundreds of millions of people who had risen from poverty within a single generation and were furnishing their first apartments, buying their first appliances, making their first consumer choices as members of a global economy. Xiaomi offered them products that looked and performed like luxury items, but were priced within reach. The emotional power of this proposition should not be underestimated. It was not just commerce, it was a form of economic justice, or at least it was experienced that way by the millions of fans who packed Xiaomi's online flash sales and filled its product review sections with passionate testimonials. By 2018, on the eve of its initial public offering, Xiaomi's ecosystem had matured into something without clear precedent in the technology industry. It was not a conglomerate. Xiaomi did not own most of these companies outright. It was not a franchise system. The ecosystem companies maintained significant operational independence. It was not simply a venture capital portfolio. Xiaomi's involvement went far beyond financial investment. It was something genuinely new, a platform-orchestrated network of aligned companies, bound together by shared design principles, common technology standards, unified distribution, and a mutual commitment to a pricing philosophy that prioritized access over luxury. The smartphone remained at the center, the sun around which everything orbited, but the system had achieved enough mass and complexity to exert its own gravitational force. Users who bought a Mi Band were more likely to buy a Mi air purifier. Users who owned 3 Xiaomi IoT devices were more likely to buy a 4th and a 5th. The ecosystem was self-reinforcing, a flywheel of engagement and loyalty that grew more powerful with each new product category it entered. Lei Jun sometimes compared Xiaomi to Costco, a company that made very little money on individual products but generated enormous value through membership and volume. Others compared it to IKEA, another company that had democratized design and built a lifestyle empire around the middle class. But neither analogy fully captured what Xiaomi had built. Costco sold other companies' products at low margins. Xiaomi was co-creating the products themselves. IKEA designed everything internally. Xiaomi had invented a model where external entrepreneurs did the designing, guided by Xiaomi's vision and empowered by its infrastructure. The ecosystem model was Xiaomi's most original contribution to the lexicon of business strategy, a new way of scaling innovation that leveraged the energy of startups and the discipline of a platform, creating a whole that was immeasurably greater than the sum of its parts. By the time Xiaomi's ecosystem portfolio encompassed smart home devices, personal care products, travel accessories, audio equipment, writing instruments, backpacks, sneakers, and even towels, the company had embedded itself into the texture of daily life in a way that no other technology company had achieved. You could wake up under a Xiaomi duvet, check a Xiaomi alarm clock, brush your teeth with a Xiaomi electric toothbrush, weigh yourself on a Xiaomi scale, ride a Xiaomi electric scooter to work, write with a Xiaomi pen, and come home to a Xiaomi cleaned apartment kept fresh by a Xiaomi air purifier. It was both impressive and slightly unsettling, this ambient corporate presence woven through every domestic ritual. Critics called it a data harvesting empire or a Chinese brand hegemony. Fans called it the future, a seamlessly connected life, beautifully designed and impossibly affordable, orchestrated by a company that had started with nothing but a vision and a bowl of millet congee. Whatever you called it, there was no denying its scale, its ambition, or its impact on the lives of hundreds of millions of people who, for the first time, felt that the best of modern design and technology had been made for them. Crisis and Reinvention, the 2015-2016 Slowdown and Comeback. The View from the Summit. In the closing days of 2014, Xiaomi stood atop the Chinese smartphone market like a conqueror surveying newly claimed territory. The numbers were intoxicating. The company had shipped 61.12 million smartphones that year, a staggering 227% increase over the previous year's figures. It had overtaken Samsung to become the #1 smartphone vendor in China, the world's largest and most fiercely competitive mobile phone market. Its latest funding round valued the company at $45 billion, making it the most valuable technology startup on the planet. Lei Jun graced the cover of magazines. Analysts competed to outdo each other with superlatives. The word most commonly attached to Xiaomi was phenomenon. Inside the company's sprawling Beijing headquarters, the mood was electric with possibility. Xiaomi had seemingly cracked a code that eluded others, a way to sell high-quality smartphones at razor-thin margins while building a fanatically loyal community in an ever-expanding ecosystem of connected devices. The playbook appeared bulletproof: design compelling hardware, price it aggressively, sell it online to cut out middlemen, and let the internet services layer generate the real profit over time. It was a model that had earned Lei Jun comparisons to Steve Jobs, a parallel he neither discouraged nor explicitly courted, though he was known to take the stage in his signature dark shirt and jeans. But beneath the triumphant headlines, hairline fractures were forming. They were subtle enough that most observers missed them entirely, and perhaps subtle enough that even Xiaomi's leadership underestimated their significance. The very strategies that had propelled the company's meteoric rise were about to become liabilities. The Chinese smartphone market was mutating rapidly. Consumer preferences were shifting in ways that Xiaomi's online-only model couldn't accommodate, and a pack of hungry competitors was studying Xiaomi's playbook, not to copy it, but to build something specifically designed to defeat it. What followed over the next 2 years would constitute the most dangerous period in Xiaomi's history, a crisis so severe that many industry observers wrote the company's obituary. The story of how Xiaomi nearly collapsed and how it clawed its way back from the edge would become one of the most remarkable turnaround narratives in the history of the technology industry. The cracks appear. The first warning signs materialized in early 2015, though they were easy to dismiss as growing pains. Xiaomi had set an ambitious internal target of shipping 80 to 100 million smartphones in 2015, a goal that seemed reasonable given the previous year's trajectory. Lei Jun, ever the optimist, publicly stated a target of 80 million units, with the implicit understanding that exceeding it would only add to the legend. But the Chinese smartphone market was undergoing a fundamental structural transformation that Xiaomi's leadership was slow to fully appreciate. After years of explosive growth driven by first-time smartphone buyers, the market was beginning to saturate. By mid-2015, smartphone penetration in China's major cities had reached levels comparable to developed Western nations. The era of easy growth, where a compelling product at the right price could ride the wave of millions of consumers upgrading from feature phones, was ending. The market was transitioning from a growth phase to a replacement phase, and in a replacement market, the dynamics of competition are entirely different. In a growth market, the key question is, which smartphone will you buy? In a replacement market, the question becomes, why should you replace the smartphone you already have? The answers to these two questions demand entirely different strategies. Xiaomi's model was exquisitely calibrated for the first question. It was dangerously unprepared for the second. The online sales channel, which had been Xiaomi's greatest innovation and competitive advantage, began to reveal its limitations. In China's first and second-tier cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen and their peers, e-commerce was deeply embedded in consumer behavior, and Xiaomi's flash sale model worked brilliantly. But the next wave of growth was supposed to come from third, fourth, and fifth-tier cities, and from the vast rural hinterlands where hundreds of millions of potential customers lived. In these markets, consumers were far less comfortable buying expensive electronics online. They wanted to touch a phone before buying it. They wanted to see how it felt in their hands, test the camera, and have a human being explain the features. They wanted a physical store they could return to if something went wrong. Xiaomi had virtually no offline retail presence. The company had built its entire identity around the proposition that physical retail was an antiquated cost center, that the future belonged to internet-native companies selling directly to consumers. This wasn't merely a business strategy, it was practically an ideology, baked into Xiaomi's corporate DNA, and it was about to be brutally stress-tested. Simultaneously, Xiaomi was grappling with supply chain challenges that struck at the heart of its product strategy. The company's approach of pricing phones at or near cost meant that it operated with almost no margin for error in component procurement. When Qualcomm, Xiaomi's primary chipset supplier, encountered production issues with its Snapdragon 810 processor in 2015, the ripple effects hit Xiaomi disproportionately hard. The Snapdragon 810 was plagued by well-documented overheating problems, and the delays and complications in securing adequate supplies of processors created bottlenecks that Xiaomi's lean supply chain simply couldn't absorb. The Mi Note Pro, which was supposed to be Xiaomi's marquee device for 2015 and its first serious attempt at a premium-tier smartphone, was delayed for months. When it finally launched, the Snapdragon 810's thermal issues undermined its performance and tarnished its reception. The Mi 5, which should have been the company's bread-and-butter flagship for the cycle, was pushed back repeatedly, eventually not launching until February 2016, an eternity in the smartphone industry. For a company that relied on a steady drumbeat of exciting new product launches to maintain its online momentum and community engagement, these delays were devastating. The supply chain problems exposed a deeper structural vulnerability. Xiaomi had prioritized speed, agility, and cost efficiency in its operations, but it had not built the kind of deep, resilient relationships with component suppliers that companies like Samsung, which manufactured many of its own components, or Apple, which locked in supply agreements years in advance with massive prepayments, enjoyed. When components were scarce, Xiaomi found itself at the back of the line, unable to outbid or outleverage competitors for limited supplies. The company that had disrupted the industry with its efficiency was now being punished for the fragility that came with operating so close to the edge. The rise of the counter-Xiaomi playbook. If Xiaomi's internal challenges were one blade of the scissors, the external competitive response was the other, and that second blade was cutting deep. Oppo and Vivo, sister companies both backed by the BBK electronics empire, had been watching Xiaomi's ascent with a mixture of respect and calculated patience. Where many in the industry had scrambled to imitate Xiaomi's online flash sale model, Oppo and Vivo had deliberately zigged while everyone else zagged. They invested massively in exactly the infrastructure Xiaomi dismissed as obsolete: physical retail stores. By 2015, Oppo and Vivo had built retail networks of breathtaking scale across China. Oppo alone had over 200,000 retail points of sale, many of them in the third and fourth-tier cities that represented the next frontier of smartphone growth. These weren't the sleek, minimalist Apple Store-style boutiques that Silicon Valley fetishized. They were often modest storefronts on busy commercial streets, staffed by salespeople who earned commissions and had every incentive to enthusiastically promote the brand. They plastered their logos on buildings, sponsored local events, and hired popular celebrities, from movie stars to pop singers, to appear in glossy television advertisements. The Oppo and Vivo strategy was in many ways the anti-Xiaomi model. Where Xiaomi sold primarily online, they sold primarily offline. Where Xiaomi prided itself on never spending money on traditional advertising, Oppo and Vivo spent lavishly on television commercials, celebrity endorsements, and billboard campaigns. Where Xiaomi offered rock-bottom prices with minimal margins, Oppo and Vivo priced their phones higher, not exorbitantly so, but high enough to fund their retail networks and marketing blitzes while still delivering healthy profits. Where Xiaomi targeted tech-savvy early adopters who compared spec sheets and processor benchmarks, Oppo and Vivo targeted mainstream consumers who cared about how a phone looked, how good its selfie camera was, and how quickly it charged. The results were devastating for Xiaomi. In the second half of 2015, Oppo's and Vivo's sales surged, while Xiaomi's growth stalled. The numbers told a brutal story. Xiaomi ended 2015 with approximately 70 million smartphones shipped, a respectable figure in absolute terms, but well below the 80 million target, and a profound disappointment given the 100 million aspiration. More alarmingly, while Xiaomi's growth was decelerating, Oppo and Vivo were accelerating. The trajectory lines were crossing, and they were crossing fast. Huawei, China's other smartphone giant, was attacking from the opposite direction. While Oppo and Vivo were outflanking Xiaomi in the mid-range market with superior distribution, Huawei was moving aggressively upmarket. Under the leadership of Yu Shengdong, known as Richard Yu, the charismatic and sometimes combative head of Huawei's consumer business, the company was investing billions in research and development, building its own Kirin chipsets through subsidiary HiSilicon, and positioning its flagship Mate and P-series phones as genuine premium alternatives to Samsung and Apple. Huawei's marketing emphasized technology leadership, engineering excellence, and a sophistication that implicitly positioned Xiaomi as the budget option, the phone you bought when you couldn't afford a real one. This triple threat, Oppo from the retail trenches, Vivo from the selfie-obsessed mainstream, and Huawei from the premium heights created a competitive vice that squeezed Xiaomi from nearly every direction. The company that had once seemed to be rewriting the rules of the smartphone industry now appeared to be trapped by the very rules it had written. The humbling of 2016. If 2015 was the year the cracks appeared, 2016 was the year the edifice nearly crumbled. The numbers were stark, and for a company accustomed to hyperbolic growth, genuinely alarming. According to IDC, Xiaomi shipped approximately 41.6 million smartphones in China in 2016, a precipitous 36% decline from the previous year. The company that had been China's #1 smartphone brand just 2 years earlier had fallen to 5th place behind Oppo, Huawei, Vivo, and Apple. The fall was swift and merciless, and it played out in the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Every quarter brought new data that seemed to confirm the narrative that Xiaomi was a flash in the pan, a company that had ridden a wave and was now being pulled under by the undertow. The tech press, which had been so effusive in its praise during the boom years, pivoted with the enthusiasm of the newly disillusioned. "Is Xiaomi finished?" became a recurring headline. Analysts downgraded their assessments. Some suggested that Xiaomi's $45 billion valuation had been a mirage, a product of venture capital exuberance rather than fundamental business strength. Inside Xiaomi, the crisis was felt viscerally. Employees who had joined the company during the glory days, drawn to the excitement and the promise of stock options that would make them wealthy, watched as the company's implied valuation cratered. Morale, which had once been among the highest in China's tech industry, became fragile. Some key talent began to leave, lured away by competitors, or simply losing faith in the Xiaomi story. The problems were interconnected and reinforcing. The supply chain issues led to product delays. Product delays meant that Xiaomi had fewer exciting new devices to offer consumers. Fewer new devices meant less buzz on social media and less engagement from the Mi fan community. Less buzz meant lower flash sales. Fewer flash sales meant lower revenue. Lower revenue meant less leverage with suppliers. Less leverage with suppliers meant more supply chain issues. The virtuous cycle that had powered Xiaomi's rise had become a vicious cycle dragging it down. The quality problems compounded the situation. As Xiaomi scrambled to fill its product lineup and maintain price competitiveness, some of its mid-range and budget offerings began to suffer from quality inconsistencies that would have been unthinkable during the company's ascent. The Redmi Note 3, while commercially successful, was followed by products that felt rushed, iterative rather than innovative. The meticulous attention to design and user experience that had characterized Xiaomi's early products, the quality that had made Mi fans feel like they were getting a $500 phone for $200, was harder to maintain when the company was under siege on every front. Perhaps most painfully, the perception of the Xiaomi brand was shifting. In its early years, Xiaomi was the cool underdog, the disruptor that gave tech enthusiasts a way to get flagship-level technology at a fraction of the price. There was a genuine counterculture cachet to carrying a Xiaomi phone. It signaled that you were savvy enough to know that you didn't need to pay Apple or Samsung prices for a great smartphone. But as Oppo and Vivo grew, and as Huawei climbed into the premium tier, Xiaomi's positioning became muddled. To mainstream consumers, it was just a cheap phone brand. To aspiring premium buyers, it lacked the prestige of Huawei, let alone Apple. The brand that had once meant smart value was in danger of simply meaning cheap. Lei Jun takes the reins. The severity of the crisis demanded a response commensurate with its magnitude, and it came from the one person who had both the authority and the emotional commitment to attempt it. In May 2016, Lei Jun made a decision that would prove to be the pivotal moment in Xiaomi's history. He personally assumed direct control of the company's supply chain and hardware operations. This was not a symbolic gesture or a CEO making a show of rolling up his sleeves for the benefit of investors and the press. It was a profound structural reorganization of how the company operated, driven by Lei Zhan's recognition that the problems Xiaomi faced were not peripheral but fundamental. The company's supply chain was broken. Its product pipeline was disrupted. Its relationship with component suppliers was inadequate. These were not problems that could be solved by a new marketing campaign or a clever software update. They required someone with ultimate authority to make decisions, override bureaucratic resistance, and impose discipline on operations that had grown too fast and too loosely. Lei Zhan, who had spent much of the previous 2 years focused on strategy, ecosystem development, and his role as the public face of Xiaomi, now immersed himself in the granular, unglamorous details of supply chain management. He personally visited component suppliers, he reviewed procurement contracts, he restructured the relationships between Xiaomi's hardware teams and their supply chain partners. He brought in new talent with deep experience in hardware operations and manufacturing, people who understood the rhythms of component procurement, the politics of fabrication capacity allocation, and the thousand small decisions that determine whether a phone launches on time with adequate quality and sufficient inventory. One of Lei Zhan's most consequential early decisions was to hire several experienced operations executives, including people with backgrounds at companies like Samsung and other established hardware manufacturers. These were not the typical Xiaomi hires, young, internet native, and steeped in the culture of software development and online marketing. They were industry veterans who understood the physical supply chain in ways that Xiaomi's existing team did not. Their arrival signaled a new seriousness about the hardware side of the business, an acknowledgement that Xiaomi could not succeed as a software and services company if it couldn't reliably produce and deliver the hardware those services ran on. Lei Zhan also initiated a systematic review of Xiaomi's product portfolio and development processes. The company had been launching too many products too quickly, spreading its resources thin and creating internal competition between product lines. The Redmi sub-brands, which had been enormously successful in driving volume in the budget segment, was cannibalizing the main Mi brand in some market segments. The proliferation of SKUs was creating confusion among consumers and complexity in the supply chain. Lei Zhan moved to rationalize the portfolio, reducing the number of models in development and focusing resources on a smaller number of devices that could each be executed with greater care and precision. But the most strategically significant shift that Lei Zhan initiated during this period was also the most humbling, the acknowledgement that Xiaomi needed offline retail. This, for a company that had built its identity around the proposition that online sales were the future, was something close to an ideological capitulation. Xiaomi's founding narrative was in part a story about how the internet could eliminate the inefficiencies of physical retail. To now invest in brick-and-mortar stores was to admit that the narrative had been, at best, incomplete. Yet, Lei Zhan approached the challenge not as a retreat, but as an evolution. He studied the retail models of companies he admired, Apple, Costco, Muji, and began to develop a concept for a new kind of Xiaomi retail experience. The idea that took shape was Mi Home, Xiaomi Jia, a chain of company-owned stores that would showcase not just smartphones, but the full breadth of the Xiaomi ecosystem. Air purifiers, fitness bands, power banks, headphones, rice cookers, all the products from Xiaomi and its ecosystem partners would be displayed in clean, inviting spaces designed to demonstrate how the pieces of the Xiaomi universe fit together. The first Mi Home stores opened in late 2015 and early 2016, initially as modest experiments, but Lei Zhan quickly recognized their potential. The stores achieved remarkably high revenue per square meter, reportedly second only to Apple stores among electronics retailers. The ecosystem strategy, which had sometimes seemed like a distraction from the core smartphone business, turned out to be a crucial advantage in the retail environment. Customers came in to look at phones and left with a phone, a fitness band, a power bank, and a set of earphones. The diversity of products drove foot traffic, encouraged impulse purchases, and made the economics of physical retail work even at Xiaomi's characteristic low margins. Lei Jun set an ambitious target: 1,000 Mi Home stores across China. It was a number that would have seemed absurd during Xiaomi's online-only era, but it reflected the new reality. The company that had once disrupted the industry by eliminating physical retail was now disrupting physical retail itself, creating stores that were more efficient and more engaging than those of its competitors. The Mi Home strategy was, in many ways, the physical manifestation of a deeper philosophical recalibration happening inside Xiaomi. Lei Zhan had always spoken about efficiency, about removing layers of middlemen, about delivering value directly to consumers. But the company's original approach had defined efficiency too narrowly, equating it almost exclusively with the elimination of physical infrastructure. What the crisis taught him was that efficiency was not about any single channel. It was about meeting consumers where they actually were and serving them in ways that generated trust, satisfaction, and repeat purchases. A farmer who lived 2 hours from the nearest major city and had never bought anything online was not going to be converted to e-commerce by philosophy alone. He needed to see the phone, hold it, compare it to the device his neighbor owned, and ask a real person whether this was the right choice for him. Ignoring that reality wasn't visionary, it was arrogant. This philosophical evolution extended beyond retail into the way Xiaomi thought about product quality and brand perception. During the hyper-growth years, speed had been the overriding imperative. Products were launched at a frenetic pace, sometimes before they were fully polished, because being first and being cheap were the twin pillars of the value proposition. But the 2015-2016 slowdown revealed the limitations of this approach. Consumers who had bought early Xiaomi phones and encountered quality issues, inconsistent camera performance, software bugs, build quality that didn't quite match the marketing images, had quietly moved on to competitors. In the budget segment, brands like Honor's sub-brand and the resurgent Vivo and Oppo were offering devices that felt more refined, more considered, more worthy of being shown off to friends. The lesson was clear. In a maturing market, price alone was not enough. Quality, consistency, and brand prestige mattered increasingly, and Xiaomi had allowed itself to fall behind on all three dimensions. Lei Jun responded by elevating the company's commitment to product quality in ways both symbolic and substantive. He established more rigorous internal testing protocols, extended development cycles for key products, and personally involved himself in product reviews and design decisions to a degree that he hadn't since the company's earliest days. The Mi Mix, unveiled in October 2016, became the most powerful symbol of this renewed focus on quality and innovation. Designed in collaboration with the celebrated French designer Philippe Starck, the Mi Mix was a concept phone that felt like it had arrived from the future. Its near bezel-less display, Xiaomi called it full screen, covered an astonishing percentage of the device's front face, achieving a screen-to-body ratio that no mainstream manufacturer had attempted before. The earpiece was replaced by a piezoelectric ceramic acoustic system that transmitted sound through the display itself. The body was crafted from ceramic, giving it a weight and tactile richness that communicated premium quality in a way that plastic or even aluminum could not. The Mi Mix was not a mass-market product. It was produced in limited quantities and sold at a price point well above Xiaomi's typical range. But that was precisely the point. It was a statement piece, a declaration that Xiaomi was capable of innovation that led the industry rather than following it, that the company could design objects of genuine beauty and technical sophistication. The device earned Xiaomi something that money couldn't directly buy: respect from the design and technology communities. The Mi Mix was inducted into the permanent collection of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, one of the world's most prestigious museums of modern art and design. For a company that had spent 5 years being dismissed by many industry observers as merely a copycat of Apple or Samsung, this was validation of the highest order. The impact of the Mi Mix on Xiaomi's internal culture was arguably even more important than its external reception. It demonstrated to the engineering and design teams that excellence was valued. that the company was willing to invest in projects that pushed boundaries rather than simply optimizing for cost. It attracted talent. Engineers and designers who might previously have viewed Xiaomi as a place to build cheap phones now saw a company with genuine creative ambition. And it shifted the internal conversation about what Xiaomi could and should aspire to be. The company that had been born as the anti-Apple, competing on value rather than prestige, began to imagine a future in which it could compete on both. But the comeback wasn't built on flagship ambition alone. Much of the hard, unglamorous work of recovery happened in the trenches of supply chain management, inventory control, and channel development, the operational foundations that Lei Jun had identified as needing fundamental improvement. The supply chain restructuring was particularly critical. Xiaomi renegotiated relationships with key component suppliers, in some cases establishing longer-term commitments and more predictable ordering patterns in exchange for better pricing and priority allocation. The company invested in demand forecasting capabilities, using data from its online sales platforms and the growing Mi Home network to more accurately predict which products would sell in which quantities and in which regions. This reduced the costly mismatch between supply and demand that had plagued the company during the flash sale era, when some products were perpetually out of stock, while others sat in warehouses gathering dust. The inventory management improvements were closely linked to the broader rationalization of the product portfolio. By reducing the number of SKUs and focusing on fewer, more carefully planned product launches, Xiaomi was able to manage its supply chain with greater precision. Each product received more attention during development, more resources during production ramp-up, and more effective marketing support during its commercial life. The result was a healthier product lifecycle, with fewer fire sale clearances of unsold inventory and more sustained demand for each model. Internally, the organizational changes that Lei Jun implemented during this period were equally transformative, though they attracted less attention from outside observers. The company's flat organizational structure, which had been celebrated during the growth years as a source of agility and innovation, had become a liability as the organization scaled. With thousands of employees and dozens of product lines, the lack of clear hierarchies and formal processes led to confusion about decision-making authority, duplication of effort, and an inability to execute coordinated strategies across different parts of the business. Lei Jun introduced more structured organizational layers, established clearer lines of authority and accountability, and created dedicated teams for critical functions like quality assurance and supply chain management that had previously been distributed across product groups. He also made significant personnel changes, bringing in experienced executives from outside the company to complement the founding team. These hires brought expertise in areas where Xiaomi had been weakest: manufacturing operations, retail management, financial planning, and they helped professionalize the organization in ways that the founding team, for all their brilliance, had not been able to achieve on their own. It was a sign of Lei Jun's maturity as a leader that he recognized the need for this kind of external expertise and was willing to dilute the startup culture that had defined Xiaomi's identity. Many founders resist this kind of evolution, clinging to the informality and intensity of the early days, even as the organization outgrows them. Lei Jun's willingness to adapt was one of the key factors in Xiaomi's recovery. The cultural dimension of the reinvention deserves particular attention because it reveals something essential about what made Xiaomi's comeback possible. Many companies experience slowdowns. Far fewer emerge from them stronger than before. The difference often lies not in strategy, which can be copied or acquired, but in the organization's collective will to change. At Xiaomi, the crisis of 2015-2016 could have been demoralizing. The narrative of invincibility that had sustained the company through its explosive growth years had been shattered. Employees who had joined expecting to be part of the next great technology empire suddenly found themselves working for a company that the press was writing off as a fad. Morale could have collapsed, and with it the talent base that Xiaomi's most valuable asset. That it didn't collapse was a testament to several factors. First, Lei Jun's personal credibility within the organization remained extraordinarily high. Employees trusted him not because he pretended that everything was fine. He was remarkably transparent about the challenges the company faced, but because he articulated a clear and believable path forward. His willingness to take personal responsibility for the company's missteps, including his decision to step into the supply chain management role himself, sent a powerful signal that the leadership was not looking for scapegoats, but for solutions. Second, the fan community that Xiaomi had built during its MIUI days proved to be a reservoir of loyalty that sustained the brand through its difficult period. Even as sales declined, millions of passionate Mi fans continued to advocate for the brand, participate in forums, and provide feedback on products. They were disappointed, but they hadn't given up. Their loyalty gave Xiaomi a foundation upon which to rebuild. Third, the ecosystem strategy, though it had been criticized as a distraction, provided a source of revenue and excitement that kept the company relevant even as its smartphone market share declined. Products like the Mi Band fitness tracker, the Mi Power Bank, and the various smart home devices continued to sell well and win new customers, some of whom eventually became smartphone customers too. The numbers began to tell the story of recovery by late 2016 and into 2017. Xiaomi's shipment figures, which had hit their nadir in 2016 with an estimated 41 million units, a painful retreat from the 70 million of 2015, began to climb again. By the second quarter of 2017, the trajectory was unmistakable. Xiaomi was growing again, and growing fast. The company shipped over 90 million smartphones in 2017, a remarkable rebound that exceeded even the 2015 peak. By 2018, annual shipments would surpass 120 million units, a number that placed Xiaomi firmly among the world's top 5 smartphone manufacturers. The comeback was not merely real, it was dramatic, one of the most impressive recoveries in the history of the consumer electronics industry. What made the recovery sustainable, rather than a temporary sugar rush, was that it was built on genuinely improved operational foundations, rather than simply rekindled hype. The supply chain was more robust, the product portfolio was more focused, the retail presence was expanding rapidly, with Mi Home stores multiplying across China's urban landscape and providing a reliable channel for reaching the vast offline consumer base. The product quality was measurably improved, as reflected in rising customer satisfaction scores and declining return rates. And the brand perception was shifting, slowly but perceptibly, from cheap to good value, a subtle but critically important distinction. Lei Jun later reflected on this period as the most important chapter in Xiaomi's history, more defining than the founding or the initial explosive growth. Anyone can succeed when everything is going right, he said in various forms at different times. What defines a company is how it responds when things go wrong. It was a sentiment that resonated because it was clearly authentic. You could see in Lei Jun's demeanor during this period the toll that the crisis had taken and the determination that had fueled the response. He looked older, more serious, less likely to flash the boyish grin that had characterized his earlier public appearances. But he also looked more confident, not with the brash confidence of a founder riding a wave, but with the earned confidence of a leader who had stared into the abyss and found a way back. The lessons of the 2015-2016 crisis became permanently embedded in Xiaomi's corporate DNA. The company that emerged from the crucible was more disciplined, more operationally sophisticated, and more strategically flexible than the one that had entered it. The pure online model was abandoned in favor of a new retail approach that integrated digital and physical channels. The flash sale model was gradually replaced by more conventional availability, though Xiaomi retained elements of the community-driven marketing that had always been its strength. The obsessive focus on smartphone market share was tempered by a broader vision that encompassed the full ecosystem of connected devices. And the founding assumption that Xiaomi could succeed by being disruptive alone was replaced by a more nuanced understanding that sustainable success required excellence in the mundane as well as the spectacular, in supply chain management as well as product design, in retail operations as well as software development, in customer service as well as community building. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis inoculated Xiaomi against the complacency that had contributed to its stumble. The memory of how quickly fortune could reverse served as a perpetual motivator, a reminder that the market owed them nothing and that every advantage was temporary. This was not just a rhetorical posture. It was reflected in concrete organizational practices. Regular reviews of competitive dynamics became standard. Product quality metrics were monitored with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Supply chain risks were assessed and mitigated proactively rather than reactively. The company that had once been so confident in its model that it ignored warning signs was now hyper-vigilant, always scanning the horizon for the next threat. Xiaomi's crisis and reinvention resonates beyond the specifics of the Chinese smartphone market because it illustrates universal truths about organizational resilience. Growth masks problems. Success breeds complacency. The models that drive a company's rise are rarely the models that sustain its maturity. And the most dangerous moment for any organization is not the moment of crisis itself, but the moment just before, when everything seems to be working and the temptation to maintain the status quo is strongest. Xiaomi's willingness to confront its vulnerabilities honestly, to challenge its own founding myths, and to undertake painful changes while the company still had the resources and credibility to do so, was what separated it from the many technology companies that have flared brightly and then faded. By the time Xiaomi entered 2017, the company was not merely recovering, it was transforming. The smartphone that Lei Jun held up at the annual product launch event in February of that year, the MI5C, was notable not just for its specifications, but for the fact that it ran on a processor designed by Xiaomi itself, the Surge S1. It was a deeply imperfect chip, slower than comparable Qualcomm offerings, less power efficient than it needed to be, but its existence signaled an ambition that went beyond recovery. Xiaomi wasn't just trying to get back to where it had been, it was trying to become something it had never been before, a technology company with genuine depth, one that controlled more of its own destiny and depended less on the goodwill of suppliers and the vagaries of market trends. The road ahead would hold many more challenges: the complexities of global expansion, the pressures of public markets, the audacious gamble on electric vehicles, but Xiaomi would face each of them as a company that had been tested by adversity and found within itself the capacity for reinvention. The crisis of 2015-2016, so painful in the living of it, had become the furnace in which a more resilient, more mature, and ultimately more formidable Xiaomi was forged. Going global, international expansion and the India success story 2014 to 2020. The world beyond China. In the summer of 2014, Xiaomi was riding an extraordinary wave of momentum in China. The company had just become the nation's top-selling smartphone brand, overtaking Samsung in a market that most analysts considered the world's most fiercely competitive. But Lei Jun was already gazing beyond the Great Wall, his attention fixed on a map dotted with emerging markets, vast populations of young, digitally hungry consumers who had never owned a smartphone, who were just beginning to discover the mobile internet, and who could not afford the prices that Apple and Samsung demanded. For Lei Jun, these billions of potential users didn't just represent a business opportunity, they represented the fulfillment of his original founding vision: to make quality technology accessible to everyone on the planet. The decision to go global was not born of idle ambition. It was in many ways a strategic imperative. China's smartphone market, though enormous, was beginning to show the first tremors of saturation. Domestic competitors like Huawei, Oppo, and Vivo were sharpening their blades, investing billions in retail distribution and marketing campaigns that threatened to erode Xiaomi's online advantage. The writing was on the wall. Any company that defined itself solely by its Chinese market share would eventually find itself boxed in, fighting over shrinking margins in a zero-sum game. Lei Jun understood that Xiaomi's survival and its identity as a global technology company rather than a Chinese phone maker depended on planting flags far from home. But where to begin? The answer, when it came, seemed almost obvious in retrospect, yet at the time it was a gamble that many industry observers questioned. India calling. India in 2014 was a country of paradoxes. It was home to more than 1.2 billion people, yet smartphone penetration hovered around just 10%. Hundreds of millions of Indians were using basic feature phones, the kind with tiny screens and physical keypads, or no phone at all. The mobile internet revolution that had already swept through China, transforming commerce, communication, and entertainment, had barely grazed the subcontinent. Telecom infrastructure was patchy, data prices were exorbitant, and the average consumer's purchasing power was a fraction of their Chinese counterparts. For most global smartphone makers, India was an afterthought, a market too fragmented, too price-sensitive, and too logistically challenging to prioritize. Samsung dominated the landscape with a sprawling portfolio of devices at every price point, leveraging a massive offline retail network that stretched from gleaming metropolitan malls to dusty village shops. Local brands like Micromax, Carbon, and Lava competed aggressively at the bottom of the market with cheap handsets that often sacrificed quality for affordability. Apple, meanwhile, treated India as a dumping ground for older models, its newest iPhones priced so far beyond the reach of ordinary Indians that they existed more as aspirational symbols than actual consumer products. Lei Jun saw something different. He saw China 5 years earlier, a market on the brink of a smartphone explosion, waiting for the right catalyst. He saw hundreds of millions of young people who craved connectivity, who were just beginning to encounter social media and streaming video and mobile gaming, and who would leap at the chance to own a capable smartphone if only someone would offer one at a price they could afford. He saw, in other words, the perfect market for Xiaomi's value proposition. The man Lei Jun chose to lead Xiaomi's Indian invasion was Manu Kumar Jain, a young IIT Delhi graduate and former McKinsey consultant who had co-founded the Indian e-commerce platform Jabong. Jain was 33 years old when he joined Xiaomi in early 2014, and he possessed a rare combination of qualities: the analytical rigor of a management consultant, the entrepreneurial instincts of a startup founder, and, perhaps most importantly, an intuitive understanding of the Indian consumer's psyche. He knew that Indian buyers were not simply looking for the cheapest phone available, they were looking for respect. They wanted products that treated them as discerning customers rather than afterthoughts in a global corporation's quarterly report. On July 15, 2014, Xiaomi officially entered India with the launch of the Mi 3, priced at an almost provocative 13,999 rupees, roughly $230 at the time, which was hundreds of dollars less than comparably spec'd devices from Samsung or HTC. The phone went on sale exclusively through Flipkart, India's leading e-commerce platform, in a flash sale model that Xiaomi had perfected in China. The results were electric. The entire initial stock of approximately 20,000 units sold out in under 5 seconds. The Flipkart servers, overwhelmed by the surge of traffic, briefly buckled. Social media erupted with a mixture of excitement and frustration. Excitement from those who had managed to snag a device, frustration from the hundreds of thousands who had tried and failed. The flash sale model, which required customers to register in advance and then race to purchase during a narrow time window, was Xiaomi's most brilliant marketing tool and its most controversial tactic in India. Critics accused the company of artificial scarcity, of manufacturing hype by deliberately limiting supply. Consumer forums filled with complaints from people who had tried multiple times to buy a Xiaomi phone and come away empty-handed. India's e-commerce regulator even received formal complaints. But the controversy itself became a form of advertising. Every failed flash sale generated headlines. Every sold-out notification reinforced the perception that Xiaomi devices were so desirable, so extraordinarily good for their price, that demand far outstripped supply. The Mi brand was becoming, in the Indian consciousness, synonymous with something precious, a secret that savvy consumers were in on. Within months, Xiaomi launched the Redmi 1S in India at an even more aggressive price of 5,999 rupees, less than $100, bringing genuine smartphone capability to a price point that competed directly with feature phones. The Redmi 1S became a phenomenon. Over the course of several flash sales, Xiaomi sold hundreds of thousands of units, each batch evaporating within seconds of going live. By the end of 2014, Xiaomi had sold over 1 million devices in India, a market it had entered just 5 months earlier. Manu Kumar Jain, reflecting on those early days, would later describe it as lightning in a bottle, a perfect convergence of product, price, timing, and hunger. Building an Indian identity. But selling phones through flash sales on a single e-commerce platform was not a sustainable strategy for conquering a country as vast and complex as India. Lei Jun and Jain both understood that the initial blitz was merely the opening act. What followed was a methodical, multi-year campaign to transform Xiaomi from an exciting newcomer into a permanent institution in Indian consumer technology. The first critical decision was to manufacture locally. In August 2015, Xiaomi partnered with Foxconn to open its first manufacturing plant in Sri City, Andhra Pradesh, assembling phones on Indian soil using Indian labor. This was not merely a logistical optimization, though it did help Xiaomi avoid the import duties that added 12 to 15% to the cost of fully assembled devices shipped from China. It was a political and emotional statement. India's government, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, had launched the Make in India campaign with great fanfare, encouraging multinational companies to invest in domestic manufacturing. By establishing local production, Xiaomi aligned itself with national aspirations. It was no longer a Chinese company selling phones to Indians. It was, in some meaningful sense, an Indian manufacturer. The factory in Sri City was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Xiaomi opened additional manufacturing facilities across India, eventually operating 7 plants with the help of partners including Foxconn, Flex, and DBG. By 2019, Xiaomi was producing virtually all of its Indian market phones domestically, employing thousands of workers, the vast majority of them women, and sourcing an increasing percentage of components from local suppliers. The company trumpeted these facts in its marketing, and the message resonated. Xiaomi was investing in India, creating Indian jobs, contributing to the Indian economy. For a consumer weighing the choice between a Xiaomi phone and a Samsung or Chinese competitor, this narrative of local commitment added a layer of emotional appeal beyond raw specifications and price. The second transformative decision was to move beyond online sales. Xiaomi's flash sale model had generated enormous brand awareness, but India remained overwhelmingly an offline retail market. In smaller cities and rural areas where the next 100 million smartphone buyers lived, consumers wanted to touch and hold a phone before purchasing it. They wanted a shopkeeper they trusted to explain the features, set up the device, and provide after-sales support. E-commerce, for all its growth, still accounted for a minority of overall smartphone sales in India. Beginning in 2017, Xiaomi embarked on an aggressive offline expansion. The company established Mi Home Experience stores in major cities, sleek Apple Store-inspired retail spaces where customers could interact with the full range of Xiaomi products, from smartphones to earphones to power banks to air purifiers. But the real game changer was the Mi Preferred Partner program, through which Xiaomi recruited thousands of existing independent retailers across India's small towns and cities, offering them training, merchandising support, and attractive margins in exchange for dedicating shelf space and sales effort to Xiaomi products. By the end of 2019, Xiaomi products were available in over 10,000 offline retail outlets across India, a distribution network that rivaled Samsung's decades-old infrastructure. This hybrid online-offline strategy proved devastatingly effective. It allowed Xiaomi to retain its cost advantage. The company still sold a significant portion of its devices through e-commerce, avoiding the markups associated with traditional distribution, while simultaneously reaching the vast majority of Indian consumers who preferred to buy in person. The combination was lethal to competitors who had bet exclusively on one channel or the other. The coronation. The results spoke with thundering clarity. In the fourth quarter of 2017, according to IDC and Canalys, Xiaomi overtook Samsung to become the #1 smartphone brand in India by shipments. It was a milestone that would have seemed fantastical just 3 years ago, when Xiaomi was an unknown Chinese upstart selling phones through flash sales on Flipkart. Samsung, which had dominated the Indian market for years, with its massive retail presence, its billions of dollars in advertising, and its full-spectrum product lineup from budget to flagship, had been dethroned by a company that entered the market with a handful of employees, 0 retail stores, and a radically different playbook. Xiaomi didn't just reach the top, it stayed there. Quarter after quarter through 2018, 2019, and into 2020, Xiaomi maintained its position as India's leading smartphone brand, often commanding a market share of 27 to 30%. The Redmi Note series became India's best-selling smartphone line, period. The Redmi Note 4, launched in early 2017, became the highest-selling smartphone in Indian history at that time, moving over 5 million units in a matter of months. Its successors, the Redmi Note 5 Pro, the Redmi Note 7 Pro, the Redmi Note 8 Pro, each continued the tradition, consistently ranking as the most popular phones in the country. What made Xiaomi's dominance so remarkable was not simply market share, but the depth of its cultural penetration. The company had built a community infrastructure in India that mirrored what it had created in China. Mi fan clubs sprouted in cities and towns across the country, organizing meetups, sharing tips and tricks, and creating a grassroots network of brand evangelists who spread the Xiaomi gospel through word of mouth. Manu Kumar Jain, with his active social media presence and approachable persona, became something of a minor celebrity, a visible, relatable face for a brand that might otherwise have been perceived as faceless and foreign. He engaged directly with customers on Twitter, responded to complaints, celebrated milestones, and humanized the company in a way that no Samsung executive or Apple representative had ever attempted in the Indian market. By 2019, India had become Xiaomi's largest market outside China, contributing a substantial portion of the company's global revenue and, more importantly, serving as living proof that Xiaomi's model could be replicated far beyond its home turf. The India playbook, aggressive pricing, online-first launch followed by offline expansion, local manufacturing, community building, and relentless iteration based on consumer feedback, became the template that Xiaomi would adapt and deploy in market after market around the world. But India, for all its strategic importance, was only one theater in a global campaign that was unfolding simultaneously across multiple continents. Even as Manu Kumar Jain and his team were conquering the subcontinent, Xiaomi was quietly, and then not so quietly, planting its flag in Southeast Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, each market presenting its own unique challenges, its own entrenched competitors, and its own cultural complexities that demanded adaptation rather than simple replication. Southeast Asia was a natural extension of the India strategy, and in many ways the region proved even more receptive to Xiaomi's value proposition. Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand were all markets characterized by large, young, smartphone-hungry populations with growing but still constrained disposable incomes, demographics that fell squarely into Xiaomi's sweet spot. The company entered Indonesia in 2014, initially through the same online flash sale model it had used in India, partnering with the local e-commerce platform Lazada. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Flash sales sold out in minutes, generating the kind of buzz and media coverage that money couldn't buy. By 2018, Xiaomi had climbed to the #2 position in Indonesia's smartphone market, trailing only Samsung, and had established local manufacturing partnerships to circumvent import duties and demonstrate commitment to the local economy. In the Philippines, the story followed a similar arc. Xiaomi's official entry in 2018 was met with enormous consumer enthusiasm, driven in part by the gray market devices that had already circulated widely through unofficial channels. Filipino consumers, many of whom were already familiar with Xiaomi's products through friends and family members working abroad, embraced the brand with a fervor that surprised even Xiaomi's own executives. Within months, the company had opened authorized Mi stores in Manila's major shopping malls, and within a year, it had captured a significant share of the market, particularly in the sub-$200 price segment where the vast majority of Filipino smartphones were sold. In Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, each presented variations on this theme. In every case, Xiaomi leveraged the same core playbook: enter with aggressive pricing, generate initial demand through online channels and flash sales, build credibility and excitement through community engagement, and then expand into physical retail as demand outstripped what online channels alone could serve. The specifics varied. In Malaysia, the company invested heavily in its Shopee and Lazada presence to capitalize on the country's booming e-commerce culture. In Thailand, it worked closely with local telecom operators to bundle devices with data plans, but the underlying philosophy remained consistent. By 2019, Xiaomi had established itself as one of the top 3 smartphone brands in virtually every major Southeast Asian market, a feat accomplished in roughly 5 years with a fraction of the marketing budget that Samsung and Huawei deployed in the region. Europe, however, was a different beast entirely. If India and Southeast Asia were markets where Xiaomi's price-to-performance ratio could bulldoze through resistance almost on its own merits, Europe was a market where brand perception, carrier relations, and consumer expectations around after-sales service created barriers that raw value alone could not overcome. European consumers, particularly in Western Europe, were accustomed to buying smartphones through subsidized carrier contracts, browsing them in well-appointed retail stores, and expecting responsive local customer service when things went wrong. They were also, on average, willing to pay more for their devices than their counterparts in Asia, which meant that Xiaomi's ultra-budget offerings, while still attracting attention, were competing in a market where consumers often aspired to premium brands like Apple and Samsung, rather than seeking the cheapest possible option. Xiaomi's European adventure began in earnest in 2017 when the company entered Spain, a market chosen deliberately for its characteristics. Spain was a country still bearing the economic scars of the 2008 financial crisis, where consumers were more price-sensitive than in Germany or France, and where open-market, non-carrier-locked phone sales were relatively common. It was, in essence, the most India-like of the major European markets, and Xiaomi treated it as a beachhead from which to expand across the continent. The launch was orchestrated with the kind of theatrical precision that had become Xiaomi's signature. When the first Mi store opened in Madrid's Grand Via, one of Europe's most iconic shopping streets, the queue stretched around the block. Hundreds of eager consumers, many of them already familiar with Xiaomi through tech blogs and YouTube reviews, waited hours for the chance to be among the first to buy official Xiaomi products in Europe. The Spain launch was a sensation. Within months, Xiaomi had rocketed to become one of the top-selling smartphone brands in the country, capturing market share with stunning speed from established players who had dominated for years. The success in Spain emboldened Xiaomi to accelerate its European expansion. In rapid succession throughout 2018 and 2019, the company launched officially in France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Germany, and a host of smaller European markets. Each launch followed a broadly similar pattern: a splashy store opening, aggressive online pricing, and a product lineup carefully curated to appeal to European sensibilities, emphasizing camera quality, design aesthetics, and software polish alongside the raw specs per dollar ratio that had been Xiaomi's primary selling point in Asia. The European expansion forced Xiaomi to evolve in ways that purely Asian markets had not demanded with the same urgency. The company had to navigate the European Union's stringent regulatory environment, complying with GDPR data privacy requirements, CE marking regulations, and local consumer protection laws that were far more demanding than anything it had encountered in India or Southeast Asia. It had to build out a European customer service infrastructure with local language support, support, local warranty centers, and the kind of after-sales care that European consumers expected as a matter of course. It had to recalibrate its marketing, shifting away from the spec sheet-focused messaging that resonated with tech-savvy Asian consumers and toward lifestyle-oriented storytelling that connected with European audiences who cared less about benchmark scores and more about how a phone fit into their daily lives. Perhaps most importantly, Europe nudged Xiaomi toward the mid-range and upper mid-range segments in ways that its Asian markets, while also evolving, had not yet demanded with the same urgency. European consumers were willing to pay 300, 400, even 500 euros for a smartphone, prices that, while still far below Apple and Samsung flagships, were significantly higher than the $100 to $200 sweet spot that dominated in India. This meant that Xiaomi's Mi series, as opposed to the budget-focused Redmi line, found a more receptive audience in Europe, and the company invested more heavily in pushing its mid-range and upper mid-range devices in the region. The Mi 9, launched in early 2019 with a Snapdragon 855 processor, triple cameras, and a striking design at roughly half the price of Samsung's Galaxy S10, became emblematic of Xiaomi's European value proposition, a device that offered 90% of a flagship experience for 50% of the price. By the end of 2019, the results of this multi-front global expansion were staggering in their aggregate impact. Xiaomi had become the fourth largest smartphone maker in the world by shipments, trailing only Samsung, Huawei, and Apple. In Europe specifically, it had risen from essentially zero market share in 2016 to become the fourth largest brand by the end of 2019, with particular strength in Spain, Italy, France, and Eastern Europe. In India, it remained the undisputed market leader. In Southeast Asia, it was consistently among the top three. In Latin America, where it had begun making inroads through partnerships with local distributors and carriers in markets like Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, it was the fastest-growing major brand. The company's international revenue, which had been negligible as recently as 2014, now accounted for roughly half of its total smartphone sales, a transformation that had occurred in barely 5 years. This global footprint also served as an insurance policy against geopolitical risk, a consideration that would prove prescient. As U.S.-China trade tensions escalated in 2019 and 2020, and as Huawei, then Xiaomi's most formidable Chinese rival in international markets, found itself crippled by American sanctions that cut off its access to Google mobile services and critical semiconductor suppliers, Xiaomi found itself as the primary beneficiary. Huawei's misfortune was Xiaomi's windfall. In market after market, consumers who had been considering Huawei's competitively priced, feature-rich devices found themselves hesitating, uncertain whether a phone without access to the Google Play Store, Google Maps, and Gmail was worth the risk. Many of them turned to Xiaomi, which offered a similar value proposition: Chinese engineering, aggressive pricing, impressive specifications, without the geopolitical baggage. In Europe especially, Xiaomi surged through 2019 and into 2020, absorbing a significant share of the market space that Huawei was hemorrhaging. But the global expansion was not without its stumbles and frustrations. The United States, the world's most lucrative smartphone market and the ultimate prize for any consumer electronics company with global ambitions, remained stubbornly out of reach. Xiaomi had flirted with an American entry several times. Hugo Barra had spoken publicly about U.S. ambitions during his tenure, and the company had even sold accessories like power banks and fitness bands through Amazon.com. But the smartphone market itself proved impenetrable. The American market's carrier-dominated structure, where the vast majority of smartphones were sold through Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile, rather than in the open market, required the kind of deep carrier relationships and regulatory certifications that Xiaomi lacked. More ominously, the broader political environment of suspicion toward Chinese technology companies, the same currents that would eventually engulf Huawei, ZTE, and TikTok, made American carriers reluctant to partner with yet another Chinese brand, regardless of how compelling its products might be. Xiaomi wisely chose not to force the issue, focusing its resources on markets where the barriers to entry were lower and the potential returns more immediate. There were also challenges that cut across markets. Software localization remained a persistent headache. MIUI, while beloved by tech enthusiasts, often shipped with bugs, inconsistent translations, and occasional advertising within the user interface that irritated European and Indian consumers accustomed to cleaner software experiences. After-sales service, despite significant investments, still lagged behind Samsung and Apple in most international markets, with consumers sometimes facing long wait times for repairs, difficulty finding authorized service centers, and inconsistencies in warranty enforcement. The company's brand image, while improving rapidly, still carried a faint whiff of cheap Chinese phone in some Western markets, a perception that no amount of spec sheet dominance could fully dispel, and that would require years of sustained effort to overcome. And yet, when viewed in totality, what Xiaomi accomplished in its international expansion between 2014 and 2020 was nothing short of extraordinary. In 6 years, a company that had been entirely dependent on the Chinese domestic market transformed itself into a truly global brand, selling smartphones in over 90 countries and regions, with number 1 or top 3 positions in dozens of them. It had done so without the benefit of carrier subsidies in most markets, without the decades of brand building that Samsung and Apple had enjoyed, and with marketing budgets that were a fraction of what its major competitors spent. The India success story, perhaps the most dramatic and consequential chapter of this expansion, had demonstrated that Xiaomi's model was not a fluke of Chinese market conditions, but a genuinely portable formula that could be adapted to radically different cultural and economic contexts. The global Xiaomi of 2020 looked almost unrecognizable compared to the domestic Chinese startup of 2014. It was a company with offices and operations on every inhabited continent, with tens of thousands of employees worldwide, with a supply chain and distribution network that spanned dozens of countries, and with a brand that hundreds of millions of consumers recognized and trusted. The global expansion had not merely diversified Xiaomi's revenue base, it had fundamentally changed the company's identity, its ambitions, and its sense of what was possible. Lei Jun's original vision of building a world-class technology company that could compete with the best in the world was no longer an aspiration. It was an observable reality, playing out in the hands of consumers from Mumbai to Madrid, from Jakarta to Johannesburg, from Sao Paulo to Seoul. The little company that had started with 13 employees sipping millet congee in a Beijing apartment had become a force that the entire global consumer electronics industry could no longer afford to ignore.